The story begins with the main character telling about her gift. From an early age, she had a photographic memory, thanks to which she could easily and in detail remember what she saw and heard. This mainly concerned books since the protagonist loved to read, and a novel called Heal Me Lady enjoyed her special favor. After this, the audience is shown a bedroom into which a young green-eyed maid hurriedly entered carrying things and addressing a certain Lady Maleficent. The main character was confused by this because the characters of the above-mentioned book addressed one of the main villains, the noble woman Arinda Maleficent, in a similar way. The girl looked at the maid as closely as possible. She, in addition to unusually bright eyes, had chestnut hair and a lot of freckles on her face, exactly like Anna the maid of the above-mentioned antagonist. The protagonist was very surprised that she had dreamed of the events and characters of her favorite book in such detail, and while she was checking herself in front of the mirror, the maid reminded her that the time for admission was coming up soon. Only after this did the girl turn around, showing the readers her face, and it really did look exactly like how the author of the book described one of its key heroines. As for the newcomer, thanks to these words, she very quickly guessed that she found herself at the very beginning of the original storyline, when Arinda was going to study at the academy. It was a huge, majestic, and beautiful building, but devoid of tasteless luxury, and in it, in addition to Maleficent, the main character of the original source was trained. However, this did not particularly bother the brunette. She continued to consider what was happening to be an extremely complex dream, and was surprised at how detailed her imagination played everything out. At the present moment, the time traveler, like the narrator, bitterly notes that she should have guessed everything at that moment, but then after enrollment, the teacher scolded her for some misbehavior. As punishment, she ordered Arinda to goose-step 3 times around the stadium, and the girl could only open her mouth indignantly, unable to believe what was happening. It was understandable, however, because this stadium was truly enormous. The green field divided into lines stretched for many hundreds of meters, and it had to be walked through 3 times. The protagonist decided to close her eyes to this because what was happening was still unreal, and diligently walked on half-bent knees until she collapsed on them from fatigue and severe pain. This made Maleficent seriously nervous, and even scared for the first time. After all, this is a dream, there is nothing real in a dream, so why then does she feel the pain from overstrained joints and muscles so clearly? A week passed. The main character was in some room and was thinking about the fact that the whole world around her was not a dream after all, no matter how crazy it sounded. She herself was lying on the bed at that moment, with an emotional face like a brick and her legs burning like fire. In this academy they may not have used rods, but they knew how to punish no worse. At another moment, sitting at a lecture, the time traveler was thinking about the fact that things simply couldn't go on like this. She wasn't ready to seriously live the life of a villain. Therefore, the young brunette was much more concerned with the sacramental question than with her lessons. What did she need to do to find herself again in her native and familiar reality in her real body? If what was happening had really been a dream, then the girl would not have been worried at all. You never know what people dream about, but if the setting and the characters were real, then that's a completely different story. After all, Arinda Maleficent wasn't the main character or the protagonist's friend or even a peaceful supporting character. She was an out-and-out villain. But what was worse was that she was ultimately ordered to be executed by the main male character, a handsome young man with red eyes wearing noble regalia. And this happened not many decades later, when all the characters had grown old, had gray hair and wrinkles. No, the brunette's head was cut off in front of the entire people when she was in the prime of her youth. Now the time traveler was trying to figure out which strategy of action would be more optimal. She could follow the original plot exactly in the hope that after death she would return to Earth, or completely destroy the script and live for her own pleasure with a harem of her favorite guys. She was so deep in thought that she completely forgot about everything else. Only the furious cry of the indignant teacher made Maleficent return to reality. Boiling with anger, she ordered the negligent student to immediately go to the stadium and do a goose-step circle again, and the girl unfortunately had no choice but to obey. When she finished, she collapsed exhausted onto the ground, thinking that the pain in her overstrained muscles would finish her off much sooner. But after catching her breath a little, the protagonist came to the conclusion that she had only one way out. The only way to escape this alien world and return home where everything was so close, peaceful, and familiar was death, and Arianda had, as she believed, good reason to think so. She had never been in a relationship before, so like many insecure people, she believed that she was basically incapable of attracting anyone's interest in a romantic way. Another time, walking in front of a large mirror and seeing her new reflection, the heroine mentally acknowledged that her current body was certainly beautiful. However, there was one small but. The name of this but was Serena Eleanor, the protagonist of the novel, a light-eyed and fair-skinned blonde, beautiful like an incarnate deity of love. The former Earthling believed that Arianda had no chance of comparing with her. However, as she bitterly admitted, she initially had no choice. The Maleficent family had colossal influence in the empire where the plot took place. For political reasons, the emperor and the head of the family decided to conclude a marriage contract between their children, so the girl was destined to marry the crown prince from an early age. As in real history, such unions were approached with the utmost seriousness. They could not be dissolved without the most compelling reasons, such as treason to the state. But it so happened that the red-eyed youth fell in love with Serena, and the girl could do nothing about it. The author himself destined the unfortunate Arianda to be the fate of a rejected woman forced to watch from afar as her legal fiancé is happy with another. That is why the traveler believed that following the original plot would be the best option. She would be quickly beheaded. She would wake up in her own bed and forget about everything like a bad dream. Naturally, the former dugout was not nearly as sure of this as she tried to prove, but any possible alternative option was even more frightening. However, the already difficult quest was further complicated by the fact that the protagonist was at least partly in love with Eleanor. She was so sweet, beautiful, and charming that it was simply impossible to resist. Now the blonde with a good-natured smile was handing the brunette a forgotten book, and she was trying to understand with horror, how could she force herself to be at odds with such a ray of sunshine? Unfortunately, Maleficent, as it seemed to her, had no choice, so she began, as in the original source, to mock Serena, although she felt like the last pig after each time. Moreover, these mockeries were not limited to banalities like tripping. In the book, Arianda did not disdain even such harsh pranks as a smoke bomb made of chemicals, and the dugout had to repeat it. And every time the unfortunate blonde suffered, cried from pain or humiliation, the brunette cried too, and therefore tried with all her might to hide and not give herself away. But these were still relatively harmless things. Then childhood ended, adulthood began, and the protagonist began to torment Eleanor with the help of the power of her clan. William Arianda's older brother played the leading role in this. He was attracted to Serena and wanted to make her his own, and when he was refused, he got angry and vowed to make the girl's life hell. However, this was not the worst thing. Not only the siblings, but the entire Maleficent family turned against the blonde for daring to steal their power, which could be obtained through an alliance with the crown. But since the clan had no intention of incurring the wrath of the imperial heir, everyone tried to pretend that it was only Arianda who was obsessed with hatred for Eleanor and that her relatives had nothing to do with it. The protagonist knew all this perfectly well but didn't pay attention. She was going to repeat the original plot anyway, and also sincerely wanted Serena to deserve a good ending. The most obvious way to ensure that she is like that is again to repeat all the actions of the real Maleficent, so the newcomer has resigned herself to the role of a jealous tormentor and a notorious viper. The outcome was exactly what the young aristocrat had expected. She was kneeling in the pouring rain, her hands tied, while the herald read out the death sentence. The main characters also watched this. While Eleanor could not bring herself to look at her former friend, the prince watched the execution with contempt and hidden anger. Arianda's relatives, as she had expected, did not try to protect her from the imperial court. Realizing that they would not gain more power, in any case the high-born schemers simply abandoned the girl to her fate. The protagonist wasn't angry, she always knew that this was how it would be. But before she died, she took one long look at the frightened Serena, who clearly regretted everything. The blonde's face was now marred by a scar left from a long, poorly healed cut. The former dugout did not want to do this, but the scenario left no alternative. Now, when there were only a few moments left before the climax, the brunette decided to say the last lines. Taking as much air into her chest as possible, she let out a furious scream. Looking at the girl who was destined to become empress in her place, Arinda Maleficent, seething with anger and envy, screamed that she hated her to the depths of her soul. Eleanor blushed, tears began to appear in her blue eyes, so a whole flock of court ladies surrounded her in a ring and unobtrusively led her away so as not to listen to such vile things anymore. In her mind, the main character bitterly said that this was not so. She had always liked Serena very much, but alas, the traveler had no other choice, and now they could only say goodbye. The protagonist was not afraid of death, and in fact would have been equally satisfied with either outcome, returning to Earth or eternal peace. But she certainly did not expect to return to the beginning of the novel. The scene was repeated down to the last detail. Again, Arinda Maleficent woke up in her luxurious bedroom. Again, Anna, panicking because she was late, burst into the chambers. The shock was so strong that for several seconds the main character simply could not speak. She could not force her body to obey the signals of the brain to such an extent her whole being was numb. The brunette, not even suspecting the deep horror her mistress was experiencing, calmly went about her usual business, changing the bed, preparing daytime clothes, etc. The protagonist's numbness and fear were caused not only by the destruction of her hopes. She still felt echoes of the monstrous pain from the cutting of her vertebrae and neck flesh. She still felt a little dead. The idea of an endless Groundhog Day only lasting a lifetime rather than a day also seriously frightened the woman, but she quickly pulled herself together, deciding to simply try an alternative way of passing. After that, the action immediately moved forward many years. Arinda did not pretend to be a villain, and now attended the wedding of Serena and the prince, thinking that everything was not so bad. The high-born couple walked majestically along the scarlet path, surrounded on all sides by admiring spectators, but at some point the eyes of Maleficent and Eleanor met. The main character smiled tenderly at the blonde and thought that yes, such a life was definitely much better if only because there was no need to mock anyone. Immediately after this, readers are shown how Arinda sits in a dungeon and looks into the distance with annoyance, while someone's cold voice announces that she does not need 2 wives. After all, Serena wouldn't like such competition. That's what the noble crown prince said, looking at the protagonist with a mocking grin. The traveler was not so much frightened as simply extremely outraged. She could not even imagine that in reality the young sovereign would turn out to be such a psychopath as to kill even without reason. But then the girl simply rolled her eyes and sighed deeply. She had just experienced firsthand the truth of the ancient proverb, "You can't escape fate." On the other hand, she was doomed anyway, and so she allowed herself to say what no one had ever said to the all-powerful prince before, "Hey, you bastard!" To say that the brunette was shocked would be a huge understatement. Very slowly he turned to face his rejected bride, who mockingly warned that if the young man continued to do unfounded nonsense, he would definitely be overthrown. For the first few seconds, the emperor's heir looked at Arinda in amazement, and then he burst into contemptuous laughter, demonstrating what he thought of this attempt to insult him one last time. After finishing giggling, the guy mockingly suggested that Maleficent had simply gone crazy from the realization that very soon her head would be cut off like a commoner. One might assume that the rest of the clan would be outraged by such a decision and try to protect one of their own, but no. It turned out that the prince had already come to an agreement with them. In response, the now black-haired girl laughed hysterically, as if she had heard the funniest joke in the universe, and the prince, suddenly losing interest in his victim, ordered the guards to finish her off. The reason for Arinda's laughter was simple. Maleficent's clan had decided to use her like a thing even this time, even though she wasn't trying to do anything bad. But the girl quickly stopped having fun because a deadly melancholy reigned in her soul. Over these 2 lives, she was very tired of the guise of the character in the novel. She still had nothing against her murder. The main thing was that it was final, and allowed her to safely go to the next world without any jokes about reincarnation. These dreams did not come true again. Just a few seconds after the last breath escaped her body, the brunette opened her eyes to the scream of the maid Anna. The protagonist felt like the victim of a drawn-out, stupid, and completely unfunny joke. So ridiculous that she didn't even have the strength to actively get angry, so she just cursed dejectedly in her thoughts. While the brown-haired woman combed and styled her mistress's hair, grumbling about her love of long sleep, the brunette looked in the mirror and thought sadly that she had heard all this twice already. Then the main character looked at her new face, at that black hair like Ravenfeather's eyes the color of molten gold, and thought that she had managed to get used to it. The traveler was again too deeply immersed in her thoughts, as she had done for example during classes in previous incarnations. To get her attention, Anna had to call out to her mistress. But the protagonist didn't react this time either. She just mentally noted that before she always answered the maid briefly and in monosyllables without wasting energy on a full-fledged conversation. Apparently, the main character felt ashamed in front of the maid who had done nothing wrong, and even on the contrary, sincerely cared about her, because a moment later Maleficent smiled and answered, "Of course." While the inspired and delighted Anna was doing her hair, Arinda reflected on the fact that it was this modest girl from a lower class and not one of her relatives who had been with her until the end both times. Even during the first journey, when the protagonist diligently played the role of a complete scoundrel, the green-eyed brunette helped to play dirty tricks on Eleanor. Unfortunately, the price for this loyalty was clear. Beheading next to his beloved boss in front of numerous onlookers, Anna was killed first in front of Arinda's eyes. The unfortunate woman begged her mistress to help her until the very end, but the brunette could only watch in horror as her bloody head rolled across the ground. Fortunately, unlike the main character, the other characters did not remember what happened in the previous timelines, so the brunette carefreely helped the aristocrat get dressed. At this point, the protagonist noted to herself with dry humor how amazing it was to see in front of her the face of a man who had already died twice, implying that the prince had killed Anna as well. But then the former dug out with the same sarcasm, thought that no, there was nothing particularly outstanding about it, clearly referring to her own situation. If you look at it objectively, everything that was happening was sheer madness. So Arinda mentally prayed, asking God to stop these games and either bring her home or let her live an ordinary and normal life. For a moment, she even imagined a wonderful picture of herself grabbing the long-haired bearded man in a hymation by the chest and starting to shake him violently, demanding answers to this whole crazy situation. Oh, it was so tempting that Maleficent would have done it immediately if only she knew how. And Anna, meanwhile, assured the lady that she would succeed at the academy, but still she should listen to one piece of advice. The young noblewoman noted to herself that this conversation was reminiscent of the training in some video games. You can't skip it, and you are forced to listen to it over and over again. What is characteristic is that other phrases and little things changed depending on how Arinda's fate developed. But the maid invariably ended the morning with the phrase, "You are not just anyone but a lady from the house of Maleficent." And this means that not a day will pass before the brunette has an army of fans, but she only thought sarcastically that very quickly these count's sons will start running after Serena like little tails. But that wasn't the point. The maid, like an older sister, sternly reminded her that the heroine had a fiancé, so no affairs, and the protagonist barely suppressed the desire to shout that the prince was a complete bastard and would be the first to betray her. Although she didn't judge him too harshly, Eleanor exuded such an aura of beauty and love around her that it was simply impossible not to fall head over heels in love with her. But this did not change the fact that the imperial heir himself was a vile person. He had already killed her twice, and if the first time he was justified, then the second time went beyond all conceivable limits. Finally, Anna finished her ceremonial speech, reminding the young hostess that no matter how the situation developed, the aristocrat would always have her family behind her. The main character wasn't even angry. She had long ago realized that all the other members of Maleficent's family were complete scumbags who more than deserved to have a snake on their coat of arms. The head of the family, Arinda's biological father, as well as Noah, the crown prince of the empire, these are the two people whom the newcomer managed to hate to the very depths of her soul because of the problems they caused her. If there was even a ghost of a possibility, the girl would definitely try to simply run away as far as possible from these crowned freaks. But how can a 15-year-old teenager do this? For a second, the protagonist would have considered trying to break off the engagement by pretending to be crazy, but that was also a dead end. Her power-hungry relatives would not let her get away with it. Anna, not even suspecting the dark thoughts of her mistress, advised her to always remain brave and determined, and the brunette decided to do so, living for her own pleasure, without looking back at the consequences, since she would die for the third time. And the former Earthling had no doubt that this would happen, Noah could finish her off again, her relatives could kill her, or some random criminals, it didn't matter. There would still be no happy outcome. Someone else would have fallen into mortal despondency, but the protagonist was made of a completely different stuff. Like a hunted animal rushing at the hunter, she decided to show the whole world what Arrinda Maleficent is capable of. Unfortunately, it was still a long way from pompous victories and atrocities, and this journey began with Anna dragging the hysterical brunette by the hand, sternly reminding her that she had to say goodbye to her father. The time traveler sadly objected that all this was pointless because she had already been through this twice and knew everything, but only in her mind she did not say anything out loud. As for this humiliation, the heroine agreed to forgive the servant only because she had already died twice because of her mistress and had earned the right to some liberties. Therefore the young brunette waited silently and almost without complaint until Anna finished talking to Maleficent Sr., and only quietly seethed with anger and bile. The nobleman gave permission for the meeting, and Arrinda angrily ground her teeth. She hated this man to such an extent that the very sound of his voice affected her like a scarlet rag on a bull. The clan leader turned out to be a handsome and fit middle-aged man with a short mustache, a goatee, and long hair tied into a ponytail. He was reading some document when he noted that today was his daughter's day of entering the academy. He smiled at her, and this caused nothing but disgust in the protagonist because she had already experienced on her own skin how hypocritical this man was. The head of Maleficent looked at Arrinda not like a father at a child, but rather like a hungry wolf at a delicious lamb. And after a few seconds he ordered her to come closer. Someone else would have immediately obeyed, afraid of incurring the wrath of the Almighty Lord, but the newcomer only curled her lips in a contemptuous sneer, folded her arms across her chest, and replied that she did not want to. These simple words and actions had a truly magical effect. The man who had been very self-confident just a second ago now looked at his daughter with almost horror and asked what that tone was. However, this was only the first move. Lazily blowing on her hand, the protagonist retorted that this is not at all what a father who forgot about his own child's holiday should say. This impudence actually had a significant miscalculation. The newcomer remembered very well that Arrinda was the only Maleficent girl in her generation, as well as the prince's fiancée, which allowed her to put a little pressure on those around her. Even her father had to watch his words in conversation, and indeed the man, although he tried to smile again, clearly looked confused and tried to justify his forgetfulness by being busy. In response, the former dugout woman merely waved her hand and indifferently replied that it was fine, the priest could continue working. This was her way of showing her resentment. However, Arrinda was ready to forget this blatant indifference to her, the future wife of the emperor, on one condition: that others would pay for her expenses every month. She was determined to become a hedonist, living solely for her own pleasure, and to do this she needed to have some kind of unlimited and accessible source of income. The head of Maleficent didn't say anything. He continued to stare at the protagonist with shock, as if a computer had caught a system error, and the girl, considering herself the winner, announced her departure. If in the morning she was in the most disgusting mood, now, on the contrary, Arrinda was ready to dance and sing, and this was only the beginning. She was going to knock more and more money out of her father. The next frame shows the reader riding in a luxurious carriage, looking out the window at the road with boredom. She has followed this route too many times. The carriage approached a huge fortress wall, behind which one could see the roofs of a colossal academy. The Empire took great care to ensure the safety of its noble youth. An ordinary person would probably feel awe in front of this enormous building, but the main character was coming here for the third time and no longer felt anything special. Only from the outside could this seem like something remarkable or funny, but in reality such reincarnations brought terrible boredom to the protagonist. For example, she had to take an exam for the third time, and nothing interesting is expected from now on either. Again, the struggle for the best grades, again the need to get out of bed at the crack of dawn, and attempts not to irritate the quarrelsome teachers. Because of this, the girl thought with a bitter smile that perhaps it would have been better if she had been kicked out of the academy altogether. Perhaps then she would not have died at a young age. And good-natured Anna, not suspecting what dark thoughts tormented her mistress, looked at her from the window, for a long time cried and waved her hand, begging her to send letters home regularly. What is characteristic is that Arinda saw this farewell for the third time already, but this simple, affectionate address invariably touched her to the depths of her soul, so that she went to inspect the territory only after she herself had wiped away her tears. Maleficent quickly realized that something was wrong with the academy this time. It was completely deserted, with no teachers, cleaners, or other students in sight. After a few minutes of wandering through deserted alleys and parks, the young aristocrat came out onto a large square, in the center of which stood a beautiful and majestic fountain with clear water. Like all the other elements of the establishment, it was clearly designed to awe every passerby, but the heroine simply sat down on its edge. She had some not-so-good memories associated with this fountain. In her first life, when the newcomer was trying hard to play the villain, she once pushed Serena into the water. But what followed next was not so much an embarrassment to Eleanor as it was to Arinda herself, who discovered that the blonde remained stunning, even when wet. Even now, after many years and 2 whole new incarnations had passed, the protagonist loved to remember this exciting sight, feeling the blood rush to her face. This also prompted the traveler to reflect on the fact that the author had also treated Serena unfairly. She was not only beautiful, but also very kind, and therefore such a bastard as Prince Noah simply did not deserve her. Then Arinda thought with even greater excitement that if the situation had turned out a little differently, then Eleanor could have fallen in love with her. How was she any worse than all these guys after all? Once again lost in her dreams, the protagonist completely stopped paying attention to the situation around her, and therefore did not notice how someone approached her, and feeling someone else's touch and hearing a strange voice, she recoiled in horror. Such a sharp reaction was explained very simply. The mysterious stranger who disturbed the peace of the aristocrat turned out to be none other than that very Serena. The blonde blushed awkwardly and timidly asked if she had scared the brunette much, and the latter hastened to assure that she had not, although in fact she looked like a panicking possum. For Arinda, who was shy and panicked when it came to romance, it was almost a nightmare come true. She could not even imagine that the object of her affections was such a lark. In addition, the fact that the younger Maleficent was supposed to be a self-confident girl who would not bend over backwards for anyone also played a role. But just the sight of the blonde made the newcomer get confused in her words and get out of character. But then the protagonist remembered that she had vowed to herself from now on to live the way she wanted, without regard for the original script. So what was the point of pretending to be the Snow Queen? Having come to this thought, the girl turned around with a gentle smile and rosy cheeks. It was such an unusual sight that it seemed as if roses were blooming in the air. Serena smiled back and asked the best way to get to the banquet hall, because her navigation skills turned out to be very poor. The time traveler again felt as if a huge needle had been poked into her heart. Talking to her favorite character was like communicating with a world celebrity. In any case, the main character was not going to refuse. Continuing to blush and stutter, she invited the blonde for a short walk around the academy. But before they could take a step, Eleanor pointed out that they both wore scarlet ribbons on top of their clothes, and the protagonist replied, "Indeed," after which she was horrified at the nonsense she had blurted out. Instead of playing Captain Obvious, I should have seductively replied, "Oh, we're in the same class, so let's be friends," and taken Serena for a walk. But now, alas, the chance is hopelessly lost. Luckily for the shy book lover, the blonde was the one who suggested dropping the formalities, leaving the brunette hanging with her mouth slightly open. Smiling radiantly, the protagonist of the original book suggested switching to the informal you. It even seemed to her that this meeting was predetermined by fate itself. For a few seconds, Arinda Maleficent stood as if struck by lightning, and then her face turned pink, her eyes sparkled as if about to cry, and she squeaked out an agreement with difficulty. After this, the girls told each other their first and last names, and Eleanor suddenly became worried. She immediately realized that she was seeing the future bride of the crown prince in front of her. The Earthling asked not to think about it because everyone is equal at the academy. But when Serena replied that her new acquaintance was very kind, the protagonist awkwardly looked away. She remembered what she did in her first life. To reassure her, Eleanor boasted a little, saying that she was a good judge of character, which meant that Arinda had no reason to be embarrassed by such compliments. The brunette remained silent, but thought with bitter sarcasm that if Serena had chosen Noah as her lover, then on the contrary this signaled her complete blindness in such matters. Exchanging remarks, the girls learned that they would not only be studying in the same stream, but also chose the same specialty, magical arts and everything connected with them. Looking at how sincerely Eleanor rejoiced at this coincidence, the protagonist again thought with bitterness that she had once cruelly mistreated this cutie, following the plot of the novel. No one remembered this, only the former Earthling retained knowledge of previous lives. But it was still difficult for her to realize that those around her had no idea about this devilry with timelines. But out loud, Orinda only smiled tenderly and said that it was very nice. She certainly had no intention of dragging her inner demons out into the open for all to see. A few minutes later, the main characters reached a large square building that resembled a complex cake. This was the banquet hall. Looking at him with embarrassment and awkwardness, Serena noted that there was still a lot of time before the start of the banquet, so why not walk around a little longer? And Orinda happily supported this idea. It was very unusual for the main character, but nice to communicate in such a friendly way with her favorite character, especially after the last time they were enemies. And the second time, to be honest, Maleficent died because of Eleanor. The latter's guilt was very indirect because no one expected such madness from Noah, but nevertheless. And now in their third life they chat as if they had been best friends for years, even though they had only met a few minutes ago. It made my head spin. As Orinda slowly opened the large wooden doors, Serena noted that they must have been the first to arrive at the academy because there was still no one else in sight. Or rather, that's how it seemed. The protagonist didn't even have time to fully open the passage when she froze like a pillar of salt because the Crown Prince himself appeared in front of her. The atmosphere instantly became red hot. No one was throwing fists at each other, but the brunette looked at the groom with exactly the same look that wild buffalo give to passing hyenas. And Noah Hensley von Edmund, either ignoring or sincerely not noticing the aura of cold hostility, calmly noted how surprising it was. The very first person he encountered within the walls of the academy was Lady Maleficent. Serena immediately asked who it was. She couldn't see the young man and only heard his voice, but Orinda lied that there was no one else there and blocked the view with her back. As for the voice, the protagonist with the sweetest smile suggested that it was just a dog, some kind of stray mutt. And the Crown Prince's red eyes widened in shock, unable to believe that someone had the nerve to say such a thing about him. The main character did not give His Highness a chance to demonstrate himself and his arrogance. She quickly and with all her might slammed the gate, making it clear that the unpleasant meeting was over. Then the time traveler took the blonde by the hand and unobtrusively led her along for a walk, and at the same time smiled as if higher powers had bestowed upon her the most desired blessings. She simply enjoyed the fact that she had brought the hated nobleman, her twice murderer, down to the ground, and was going to continue in the same spirit, taking it out on everyone she couldn't stand. After this, the girlfriends went to the greenhouse where beautiful orange flowers similar to roses were blooming. Serena, with admiration and the greatest care, picked one of them. Orinda, however, had no time for this. She was thinking about a way to separate Noah and Eleanor forever, but it was clearly beyond the power of an ordinary character, even a villain. No matter how events unfolded, two key elements of the plot remained unchanged. The blonde fell in love with the crowned tyrant, and Maleficent lost her head on the chopping block. After that, she will most likely wake up in her bed again under Anna's stern shouts and start the passage from the very beginning, like a prisoner of a time loop or a persistent gamer with her favorite game. The protagonist thought with slight melancholy that if reincarnation really existed, it would be very good if she became someone, but she did not have time to finish the thought due to interference. Serena, seeing that her new friend had once again dived into the depths of her thoughts, pulled her back into reality to ask if everything was okay, and Orinda lied that it was. Eleanor, however, was not going to calm down. She repeated whether everything was really okay. Then Maleficent drooped too sharply, and then suddenly she herself became bored. As it turned out from the narrator's explanations, the protagonist of the novel possessed a magical gift. She could feel the true emotions of the people around her. It was also because of this that she got together with Noah. Serena felt that under this cold and arrogant shell, there was a surprisingly emotional soul, and this is where their affair began. True, in the book, the blonde told almost no one about this peculiarity of hers, and the time traveler decided to assure her friend just in case that sharing the secret was not necessary. Then Eleanor smiled again as if the sun had come out from behind the clouds and chirped that it was not in vain that she had spoken to Arinda. The latter really was a wonderful person. As a token of gratitude, she handed the brunette a bud of that very flower and said that its orange leaves were very reminiscent of the golden eyes of the main character. Then Serena simply said, "You are beautiful." And those words made the former earthling stare ahead, dumbfounded, her cheeks suddenly turning pink. While the protagonist was sobbing hoarsely from a quiet hysteria, life began to appear in the park. Dozens of people began to fill the academy, bringing echoes of conversation, the sounds of footsteps and other noise. This was the best sign that the time for walking was over. The annual celebration was about to begin, so the girls decided to hurry. Looking sadly at the small flower in her hands, Arinda thought that now the plot would really begin. It was at the banquet that Eleanor would meet all the main male characters. Among them, of course, will be the damned Noah Edmund, the red-eyed heir to the throne, and the time traveler presented this situation as if it were happening in reality. Here is Serena, slightly out of breath from being late, running into the room and looking around in confusion. Everyone else looks at her in shock in response, struck by her beauty, and the girl awkwardly takes a step back, bumping into someone. It turns out, of course, to be the prince with all his cold arrogance, majestically asking those gathered what all the noise was about. What happens next is very reminiscent of cliched scenes from formulaic romantic movies. The main characters look at each other for a while, as if the rest of the world has disappeared, turned into emptiness. Then, as if an invisible lever clicked, Noah's eyes widened, unable to believe that he was seeing such beauty, while the young man's heart beat even faster and louder than before. This is exactly how the meeting of the protagonists in the book went, and Arinda now could not help but feel a bitter irony. Back then on Earth, she sincerely believed that the prince loved Eleanor, and did not just feel lust. The hall, meanwhile, was already packed with people like a barrel with herring, and Serena noted with a good-natured smile that they had even acted smartly by not leaving their luggage there. As they crossed the threshold, there was a deathly silence. Dozens of young people of both sexes stared at the new arrivals almost exactly as it was in the original novel. Blushing slightly, the blonde suggested that they were too late to cause such a reaction, but Arihenda quietly replied that it was because of her appearance. Feeling hundreds of eyes following them, the protagonist suggested that her new friend take a secluded place somewhere in the corner, but then Noah stepped in front of them. The brunette pretended that she didn't care about the prince at all, but in fact it wasn't so. She was even scared because in the previous timelines, von Edmund never did such a thing. What happened next was even worse. Hensley grabbed the future bride by the hand without any respect, and then looking straight into her frightened eyes, spoke coldly and slowly. From the outside, one might think that the air was calm, but this was only a mask. In fact, the young man was incredibly furious because Arinda had humiliated him so much, and the girl realized in horror that he was ready to beat her right here and now without looking at the presence of witnesses. The protagonist tried to break free, but in vain. Noah was much stronger than one might have guessed from his appearance, but a moment later, the guy himself was distracted by Eleanor. It wasn't love at first sight as in the novel. Instead, they simply sized each other up, and then the blonde suddenly clenched her fists, showing her support for Maleficent. The latter was stunned by such an action. She did not understand what Serena felt that made her decide not to help her, but then Hensley roughly dragged the bride along with him. Turning around for a moment, he coldly asked if Arinda wished to die for insulting the royal person, and the heroine almost exploded with rage. After all, this crowned psycho could not finish her off so early in front of a dozen witnesses. Grinding her teeth furiously and mentally cursing the hated man, she continued to try to break free, but in vain. She might as well have tried to slow down a glacier sliding down a mountain. Von Edmund released the victim only after they both had moved away from the ceremonial hall, hiding in numerous corridors, and the girl, clutching her injured limb, stared at the brunette with an offended look. After a few seconds, Noah calmly asked her if she knew what she had done wrong, as if he were a strict but fair parent punishing a naughty child. The protagonist waved her hand in disgust and replied that she was guilty of only one thing, that she was not currently in the ceremonial hall, and the young man calmly noted that she had switched to an informal tone, which meant that she definitely wanted to die. Trying not to explode and not to pounce on the groom like an enraged cat, the time traveler retorted that he was incredibly petty, since he was picking on the difference in status on the territory of the Academy, where stratification does not exist. And this is not to mention the fact that Hensley himself was specifically exiled here for certain sins. These words had a better effect than a blow with a dagger through a hole in the knight's armor, the red-eyed youth immediately throwing off the mask of majestic calm, angrily and fearfully asked how Maleficent knew this. Of course, the reader with a photographic memory knew everything about the characters in her favorite novel. For example, that the Crown Prince once ordered the execution of an innocent servant without even bothering to understand the situation. It didn't come to the chopping block, but it seriously worried the current emperor. In the hope that the Academy would make a man out of his tyrant son, he sent Noah away. Thanks to this circumstance, the situation changed completely in favor of Arinda. Now she was pushing the frightened Hensley with words alone, without even resorting to violence. She told him to his face that for the next 3 years, von Edmund could not even count on any support from his relatives. During all these years, he would be an ordinary person. Of course, the protagonist was ready to call her vis-a-vis by her title if it was so important to him, and Noah, tiredly ruffling his hair, threatened to execute Maleficent immediately after graduation if she did not learn manners. Naturally, this had no effect. The newcomer shrugged her shoulders carelessly and declared that she would die anyway, so it didn't matter to her when and how it happened. Hensley suggested that Arinda was not quite right in the head, and her eyes immediately lit up. What if the young despot decided to break off the engagement after such a performance? The brunette immediately understood that this was exactly what the main character needed, but they did not have time to continue the conversation. A suspicious noise was heard, and the girl realized that the ceremony had begun without their participation. Having decided not to linger any longer, the young aristocrat warned the prince that she was leaving, and with a mockingly kind smile asked whether he would be able to find the right road. Without waiting for an answer, the protagonist ran back. She had just crossed the Rubicon, and now she definitely would not have been able to choose a different model of behavior, and Noah looked after her for a long time with slight fear. He was sure that the girl had gone crazy. Having run a sufficient distance, Arinda allowed herself to stop and catch her breath. Feeling the sweat running down her back, she thought that the world always remains cruel, no matter whether it is Earth or the setting of the novel. As it turned out, she was actually terribly outraged by the fact that the teachers sent only her to run around the stadium, while Hensley at best was wagged with a finger for being late. The most unpleasant thing was not even this, but the fact that Maleficent was almost the only student who was punished at all. Besides her, another boy also got his lumps. Trying to somehow smooth things over, she decided to approach the young man, asking if he really was Reynold from the fencing course, but she was ignored. In the book, this character did not speak to anyone except Serena. The author gave this poor fellow the role of a silent lover with unrequited feelings. He faithfully defended Eleanor all his life, never finding the strength to admit that he loved her. His full name was Reynold Watson. Despite his terrible shyness, narrow-mindedness, and habit of being late, he remained the main character's favorite character. And having the opportunity to talk to him personally as a real person, Arinda did not want to back down so easily. She stubbornly tried to get the red-haired guy to talk. He measured the protagonist with a long look and seemed about to send her to a certain address, but no, just the opposite. The future knight asked if it was difficult for her to run on all fours and talk at the same time. The time traveler smiled with all her might and assured Reynold that no, because her legs did not hurt at all, but in fact they ached so terribly that the girl wanted to lie down on the grass and die. And it sucked all the strength out of the brunette. Very slowly, as if in slow motion, she collapsed to the ground desperately and hoarsely breathing, while Watson calmly continued on his way. A few seconds later, the former Earthling calmly stood up and looked after her favorite with annoyance. As it turned out, she had managed to make a magical improvement for her body, so the ignoring bothered her much more than fatigue. Deciding that she couldn't tolerate such treatment, the brunette closed her eyes, and a moment later a supernatural lavender glow burst out from under the ground around her. Not even a second had passed before Arinda caught up with her favorite, and with her former ease tried to get him to talk. After all, they were both punished anyway. In response, Reynolds looked at the persistent girl with some surprise and asked again, had she really managed to recover, since just recently she looked like a walking corpse. The young noblewoman only gasped stupidly, but as it turned out Watson didn't need an answer. He assumed that Maleficent was simply very athletic, and for the first time smiled at her. After this, the main character realized that she had completely forgotten to introduce herself and told her new acquaintance her first and last name, and then told him his own. The traveler thought not without self-satisfaction that Reynolds might not tell her anything in principle because she already knew him inside out. After some hesitation, the young man remembered that Arinda was late for yesterday's entrance ceremony and asked if she understood fencing, to which the protagonist answered negatively. This puzzled Watson because such good endurance can only be developed through diligent and regular physical training, and then the girl admitted that it was all magic. After this, the heroine immediately came to her senses. She managed to forget that Reynolds is a very honest and straightforward person who prefers to communicate with the same people, and the intriguers who walk over their heads only cause him hatred. In other words, the young knight couldn't stand any form of deception or trickery no matter what: a dagger stab in the back, a cheat sheet during an exam, or a magical buff, and she admitted to him that she had resorted to such. She imagined too vividly Watson scolding her harshly for cheating during her punishment, and his sympathy meter dropping to rock bottom just like in a game. To steer the conversation away from the dangerous topic, Maleficent laughed with exaggerated nonchalance and said that such things become much easier when you already train for an hour a day. Reynolds asked if she really only did 1 hour a day, and the girl, sweating profusely, increased the time to 2, and only then realized what nonsense she had blurted out. In her mind, the protagonist had already said goodbye to the failed relationship because the young man also hated lies, but he suddenly noted that Arinda should definitely learn to wield a blade. She was wasting an incredible talent. This surprised her because the change was too abrupt, not like how the boy communicated with Serena in the novel, but the young man was already carried away by his thoughts. They shared that they were studying in Class A for magically gifted teenagers and in Class B for those who were more into physical training, and the schemer Noah was assigned to Class C. This made the young aristocrat think and remember that among her classmates there was one young wizard who could also be called the main character. But she didn't have time to tell the readers what kind of person he was. Reynolds reminded them that in the second half of the semester, students have the opportunity to change courses and advised them to think about it, but Arinda flatly refused. Watson, however, was not going to give in. He insisted and even promised to teach Maleficent everything himself, and she thought sarcastically that running 100 meters without magic was already the limit of what was possible for her. To demonstrate this, she not very naturally depicted how she suddenly lost her breath, and along with it all, her strength left her body. Of course, such a performance would not have fooled even a simpleton like Reynolds, and he directly reported that Arinda was lying to her great displeasure. Luckily for her, the unpleasant run ended soon after. The young people left the stadium, and Eleanor was already rushing towards the protagonist with a handkerchief to wipe away the sweat. The brunette accepted the gift with gratitude, but she was alarmed by the fact that Watson was still standing nearby and looking at them. Was Serena's presence holding him back? But he didn't look at the blonde at all. All of Reynolds' attention was focused only on the main character, and having borrowed a handkerchief from her, he once again asked her first and last names. Wiping the moisture from his face and neck, the red-haired youth noted that Arinda hated blade training so much that she was even willing to lie to his face about it. The protagonist realized that she had trapped herself in a classic liar's trap. She had gotten entangled in a lie, having told too many of them, and now she realized that she should have told about the magic right away. She was already gathering her strength to at least now confess everything to Watson, but he again managed to stun the brunette, assuring her that she would enjoy classes with him. Reynolds really wanted Arinda to try her hand at handling a sword and become a great warrior, and he asked her to try again. At the same time, the guy looked straight at Maleficent's face, not taking his green emerald-like eyes off her, and at some point he even blushed a little, which did not go unnoticed. The main character hesitated for only 1 second, if not less. She simply could not refuse such a noble, handsome man, and completely forgot about Eleanor's presence. The confused blonde reminded her friend how she herself, half a minute ago, admitted that she hated fencing. but the protagonist simply brushed it off, after which she clung to Reynolds. She didn't consider her behavior bad for the simple reason that she continued to believe in the immutability of the plot. No matter what she does now, Watson will still fall in love with Serena later. Accordingly, there would be nothing wrong with the girl training with this strong young knight. At least that's what it seemed to her at that moment. A little later, as the friends walked down the hallway, Eleanor reminded them that Ray was one of the most talented warriors in the academy. He even earned a scholarship, and it was simply scary to fight him. The blonde was worried that this bull would harm Orinda, for example, by sending her into a faint with one blow, but the brunette head over heels in love simply brushed it off. She assured her interlocutor that Watson was a good person. This was clear even after a short first conversation, and Serena eventually backed down, although she did not approve of such an idea. This prejudice made the newcomer nervous. Eleanor had never behaved like this before, especially around Reynolds. But then the signal sounded for the start of classes, and the brunette suggested going back. Serena was surprised that her new friend knew so much about the academy and its rules, and the protagonist lied that her brother told her everything, and then the blonde remembered that she had encountered the golden-eyed brunette several times he tried to flirt with her. The former Earthling immediately realized that it was William Maleficent, one of the most vile and persistent opponents of the main characters, but only apologized out loud for his behavior. The girls sat down at their desks, admitting that they were looking forward to the practical lessons in magic with great impatience, but they were not allowed to concentrate. Someone flew into the room calling the main character by name. It was some teenager named Tom Wilson, and he was looking for Orinda because of the Crown Prince. For some reason, Noah really wanted to see the brunette again. The protagonist was not frightened or even angry by this, simply because it seemed to her like some kind of absurd dream that Edmund needed her and not the beautiful golden-haired Serena. But Maleficent didn't let her surprise show. Instead, she snorted very demonstratively and declared that, well, she had something to say too. A few moments later, the time traveler bursts into the Class C classroom with an extremely determined look where Hensley and other high-born teenagers were poring over books. Without embarrassment in front of anyone present, Orinda loudly and clearly announced to the hated groom that she didn't care who he was, the Emperor's eldest son or God himself. If Noah had business with her, let him get off his ass and go to the girl personally and not send some messengers. The brunette was so taken aback that he could only utter a ridiculous, "What?" But Maleficent hadn't said everything yet. She loudly announced that she was very worried that her betrothed had lost his legs, but fortunately he still had both lower limbs. And of course she wasn't going to forget that thanks to him she had earned a fine and was forced to run like a chicken around a huge stadium. It was so refreshing in the morning. Looking mockingly into the scarlet eyes of the petrified guy, the protagonist finally declared that she really hoped that next time he would also run on the grass. Having said everything that had accumulated in her soul, Orinda, without saying goodbye, slammed the office door, and after that deathly silence reigned. While Class C was recovering from the shock, Maleficent walked down the hallway like a proud lioness with her head held high. She believed that Hensley needed to be taught a lesson. Because of her thoughts, she didn't notice a guy with silver gray hair on the road and ran into him, but the stranger wasn't the least bit offended. In a friendly manner, as if he were an old friend of the main character, he declared that he really enjoyed this hot performance, but the protagonist did not immediately realize that she was communicating with Luke Oscar. He was that same young, promising wizard, one of the main characters in the story, along with Reynolds, Serena, and Noah, and this guy had a self-esteem worthy of an archmage. But now the former Earthling had no desire to communicate with this scoundrel, so she warned him without unnecessary tact that she was leaving for class. But the gray-haired man was not going to give way so quickly. Unlike Eleanor and Watson, Oscar did not appeal to her at all. This character was as wild as the March hare, and wherever he went, trouble regularly arose. With a sly, fox-like smile, Luke said that he agreed to stop fooling around and go to class with Orinda, but only if she listened to his own request. The protagonist sullenly asked if she could refuse right away, and the young wizard, feigning offense, asked where such rudeness came from. For her, it would be a lucky ticket. The main character became even more disheartened. She immediately decided that Oscar wanted to use her as a sort of matchmaker to make it easier to get to know Serena. This thought made Maleficent so sick that she decided not to even listen to what the guy was going to say, but she still couldn't interrupt him. The blonde wanted the brunette herself to be his partner, and she was momentarily speechless from shock, while Luke himself laughed openly. He correctly guessed that Arienda thought he was looking for a matchmaker. He found it funny that the young magician, with all his shortcomings, was not at all the kind of person to look for intermediaries in such matters, and catching his breath, he repeated his request. Of course it wasn't about a romantic connection at all. The academy was simply set up in such a way that student sorcerers needed a partner throughout all 3 years of training in order to achieve the best results. But Arinda wasn't interested in this proposal either, which she made clear by rolling her eyes and trying to walk past the persistent trickster. Oscar tried to seduce the brunette with good grades, but she didn't care. She really wanted to become Eleanor's best friend and partner, and not someone else. The silver-haired wizard continued to beg for consent, convincing Maleficent that such a chance only came once in a lifetime, but she only tiredly asked if it was time to go to class. In the end, she just turned around and walked away feeling goosebumps running down her spine. Another character had suddenly started acting very uncharacteristically for no reason. Then she stopped abruptly and tensed just like a person who heard an arrow whistle right next to her ear, but that was partly because the guy had risked using compulsion magic on her. The protagonist was truly horrified because this clearly crossed all conceivable boundaries. This was no longer harmless children's pranks but a real mind wash. But Luke wasn't at all angry that he was rejected and his spell was broken. On the contrary, he replied with the same smile that canceling someone else's spell was a task above the level of a newly admitted teenager. This scared Arinda even more than the sudden attack, because she realized that she had just through her own stupidity destroyed her legend in front of a very smart and unpredictable person. But Oscar continued to act as if nothing terrible had happened. Demonstrating maximum friendliness, he once again offered Maleficent to study together. A small time skip occurs, and readers see the time traveler stirring a potion in a cauldron with a very sad look, wondering what kind of fly bit this gray-haired guy. She could understand why other characters like Watson and Edmund were starting to act differently than they did in the book, but she had never crossed paths with Luke, and how could he know about her magic anyway? And his constant obsessive proposals to study together were simply frightening. At such moments, the young man resembled a real stalker ready to follow his victim even to his home. However, Arinda's bad mood and hostility could be easily understood because the young magician literally stood over her soul, constantly repeating his request. Unable to bear it, the time traveler secretly but very painfully kicked Oscar on the shin, causing the latter to almost scream. But no one except the two of them noticed this little dirty trick. Someone else would have finally backed off after that kind of damage and gone looking for other prey, but the gray-haired teenager refused to stop even after that, which even Serena found strange. When the man asked if he needed a reason to make such an offer, the heroine answered harshly that she didn't care, she would have refused anyway, and then he retorted with a smile that this was precisely why he didn't state his motives. Luke laughed at his own joke for the whole class to hear, and the girls, resigned, decided to simply ignore him instead, focusing entirely on their chemistry classes. Looking at her golden-haired friend, the protagonist once again experienced a sharp attack of affection, like a crazy cat lover looking at a particularly beautiful kitten. Unable to bear it any longer, she turned to Oscar with a very sly smile, and thoughts along the lines of, "Well, how do you like it? You'll fall in love with this cutie, too," momentarily forgetting that she had sent the plot down a completely different track. That is why the young man, contrary to her expectations, did not pay any attention to Eleanor. He looked only at Arinda herself, and there was something attractive in his gray eyes. This went on for a few seconds before the teenager repeated his request with a smirk, and Maleficent, unable to bear it any longer, hysterically screamed, "No!" The silver-haired student noted with exaggerated sorrow that what bad luck he had run into a woman who was not affected by his beautiful face, which enraged the brunette even more. She still didn't understand why Oscar had chosen her out of all the people in the academy, but Serena interrupted her thoughts. She was interested in finding out what the heroine was going to do today. At first, the time traveler didn't understand what Eleanor was talking about, and then she leaned down to his ear and lowered her voice to a whisper, reminding him of Reynold Watson. As it turned out yesterday, the young knight almost got into a fight with Luke, and yet the latter had been acting completely casual all this time as if nothing had happened. After this, the audience is shown a short flashback. Then the red-haired young man approached the protagonist and asked if she had forgotten about today's training. And Oscar was right there hearing everything, and with his characteristic mocking directness, noted that the attempt to teach a wizard physical combat was completely absurd. Reynolds tried to explain that basic physical training was useful for anyone, regardless of course, but the gray-haired teenager only snorted. Looking at Watson as if he were a fool who had decided to wear his underpants on his head instead of a hat, the young wizard asked him if he really believed what he had just said. The author did not show the audience the conflict that had flared up, which almost escalated into a fight, but instead showed Arinda's thoughts. After thinking about it all thoroughly, she realized what the problem was. Fate was supposed to have it that all the prominent men of the Academy would fall head over heels in love with Serena as the author of the novel intended. But for some reason everything changed so that the young men began to flirt with Maleficent instead. Eleanor also asked how Noah was doing because the last time she had passed Edmund the latter had been feeling depressed, probably because of the public humiliation. What bothered the brunette was not this, but the fact that Hensley simply walked past the blonde without trying to force an acquaintance on her. With the same success, one could imagine how the moon would one day simply walk away from the earth. The second girl, of course, didn't know that she was a character in a romantic book and therefore didn't attach any importance to what happened. After all, what reason would a complete stranger and even an engaged guy have to pester her? Because of this, the former dugout once again felt like the victim of some absurd and excessively drawn-out prank. She knew perfectly well that Noah had a very significant reason. Only after this did the protagonist seriously consider that her behavior could have had too much of an impact on the world around her, since the main characters now began to ignore each other. On the other hand, this meant that now the main character might not die at 20 years old. Instead, she could be killed for any reason, and at any moment, which made the girl feel a terrible heaviness in her soul. Orinda had simply come to terms with the fact that she would only live 5 years until she turned 20, and now it was as if the ground had been pulled out from under her feet. She even began to think about whether to erase the Crown Prince's memory or even kill him on the sly. Serena, literally feeling someone else's anxiety, gently touched the brunette's hand and asked her not to worry about something that hadn't come true yet, which made Maleficent blush. These simple words and actions managed to completely change the protagonist's mood. She really realized that it was too early to throw a tantrum and that it was better to just wait. Maybe Von Edmund would even call off the engagement. An ancient proverb says that if you mention the devil, he will certainly appear in person. And this is what happened this time with His Imperial Highness. Noah Hensley really wanted to talk about something with his future bride and was not even embarrassed to come to her in person, remembering the past humiliation. But at the same time, he looked so handsome that he would be put in a coffin. After this, the action moved to a large hall in which decorative trees grew. This place clearly served as a recreation center for the inhabitants of the Academy. Arinda followed Edmund, feeling cold, sticky goosebumps running across her skin. She was very frightened by the prince's motives, but she tried to calm herself with the knowledge that at the very least he would not try to kill the offender. The Academy was very careful about its reputation as a place where noble young men and women were safe. But even if the brunette went crazy and finished off Orinda, what difference did it make? She had already died twice. This is exactly what the time traveler kept repeating to herself, trying to calm down until suddenly Oscar appeared right behind her and asked mockingly if it was really so scary to find herself in the company of her fiancé. The girl mentally sighed. Not only were her nerves on edge, but this trickster had also shown up, and the young wizard carelessly added that he wanted to make sure his partner was safe, since she and Noah had such bad looks on their faces. Then the protagonist remembered that since Luke was here, Serena was completely alone in the classroom. The magician calmly left her because it was more fun in the company of the Crown Prince and Maleficent. The main character was so angered by the gray-haired guy's frivolous attitude to any situation that she could not stand it. She attacked him for the first time, sending a stream of fiery energy. Oscar easily deflected the enemy projectile, literally brushed it away with his finger, as if it were an annoying fly. and then solemnly declared that from the first day he was interested in Arinda and not anyone else. The former Earthling did not immediately remember that the entire dialogue took place within Noah's earshot, and she also noticed too late that the wizard had deflected the fireball towards the prince. Luckily, the spell was too weak to kill or even injure the man. Instead, it simply crashed into the brunette's head like an egg launched from a slingshot, and Maleficent couldn't help but thank her annoying acquaintance for this pleasant mischief. Von Edmund very slowly touched the back of his head as if he couldn't believe that someone had dared to do such a thing to him, and then just as slowly turned around, and his face was expressionless. Looking at the carefree and brazenly grinning Luke, and slightly nervous Arianda Hensley coldly asked the young sorcerer who he even was. Unable to contain himself, the young wizard laughed desperately like a hyena, so much so that even the protagonist had to kick him in the ribs to bring him back to normal. Having exhaled, the main character advised her unloved fiancé to simply not pay attention to the gray-haired man. He was still crazy, and Oscar happily agreed with this. The time traveler irritably said that it was not a compliment at all, but Luke responded to this with his invariable fox-like grin. Any nitpicking was like a drop in the bucket for him. The prince watched this whole comedy with an inscrutable face, but in his red eyes one could easily read a desperate, "Lord, who are these two half-wits?" Having decided that he had had enough of the circus, Noah Hensley von Edmund began to speak. Last time Arinda had raised quite a fuss by insulting him, the heir to the empire, in front of many people. The brunette had no intention of forgiving or forgetting such an insult, and the feverish gleam in his gaze confirmed it best of all. If it weren't for the Academy's protection, Maleficent would have been strangled right here and now. Even she was frightened by this bloodthirsty gaze, and she seriously thought about whether she should finish off the crowned tyrant first, or whether she could tolerate one more death. The girl herself quickly became angry at this thought. She thought very gloomily that if Noah had not finished her off twice the first time, then there would not have been any problems. Hensley noted that Arianda had never behaved like this before, so he asked again if his fiancée had really lost her mind. In response, the protagonist wearily shook her head and replied that it didn't matter at all. She was destined to die again at the hands of her fiancé anyway, so why should he care about such nuances? Von Edmund repeated the word again in bewilderment. Like all the other characters, he could not know that the main character had already experienced several time periods. Instead of answering, Maleficent turned away in irritation and muttered under her breath that if her prospective husband had one good quality, it was his keen hearing. Oscar leaned over to the brunette with obvious concern and asked if the prince had tried to finish her off after that public quarrel, but she replied that no, it would just happen one day. Then Luke folded his hands behind his head with a carefree air and remarked that the main characters were very funny. At this point, he looked more like a spectator enjoying a ridiculous show. With a sly look, the boy asked the girl if she regretted what she had done that time, and Arinda answered without hesitation, "No, nothing like that." Then the silver-haired man affectionately patted the young aristocrat on the head and sincerely admitted that it was precisely for this quality that he liked her so much. The brunette blushed in embarrassment, snorted loudly, and abruptly slapped Luke's hand away, while the prince meanwhile began to talk again about how he was not going to turn a blind eye to his dishonor. The issue was not so much about him as about the undermined authority of the entire imperial family. Ignoring disrespect would have created a dangerous precedent, so such things were always punished mercilessly. Of course, Hensley was ready to make allowances for the fact that he and Arinda were equals at the Academy, and that there was simply a misunderstanding between them, and therefore he was ready to show mercy, if within 3 years until the end of her studies the brunette would offer a sincere apology. But if the young man thought that Maleficent would be impressed by his mercy, he was never so wrong. Instead, she furiously showed her middle finger to her betrothed. For a moment, everything froze, and there was silence. The main characters stood opposite each other, saying nothing while the rest of the students wandered around the area, quietly talking and laughing. Oscar's eyes sparkled with admiration. Even he, a considerable joker and trickster, was very impressed by such a rude and frank message from the future ruler of the empire. A second later, he gently squeezed the heroine's hand and began to squeal excitedly about how much he liked her, just like a little child in love. The protagonist dryly noted that it was she who did not want to please Luke, but the latter, without a shadow of embarrassment, retorted that everything was fine. This is how he really feels. They argued for a few seconds until Noah interrupted them. Trying to control himself, the prince reminded them that even such a powerful clan as Maleficent would definitely be punished for a crime against the crown. The time traveler clarified whether this was really an attempt to threaten her using her relatives, but Orinda's face and gaze did not show fear at all, quite the opposite. Hensley did not miss this. Folding his arms across his chest, he calmly asked if the young aristocrat really was indifferent to the fates of her father and brother. And yes, she didn't give a damn. These two were first-class scumbags and scoundrels, so the protagonist would not shed a tear for the rest of Maleficent's family. And for this answer, Oscar tried to hug her to no avail. The heroine chained his feet to the floor with ice. This trick puzzled the crown prince even more, because he knew that the brunette had not studied magic before entering the academy, so why was she casting spells with such ease? The young aristocrat realized with horror that she had made a fool of herself again, and in front of her sworn enemy too, and the young gray-haired wizard, freed from his shackles, enthusiastically repeated his request for partnership. The former earthling tried to retort, saying that the young man would do well to learn to determine when he could poke his nose into other people's business and when he couldn't, but the young sorcerer, not at all offended, replied that now was just the time to act. Still smiling, he must have cast some kind of spell without even opening his mouth, because they were both engulfed in a strange, supernatural silver glow. Orinda immediately realized that this was an external manifestation of the magic of the promise, and she tensed up a little, and Luke, leaning towards her ear, clarified that along with the partnership he was offering membership in the Magic Tower, and Maleficent should know what that meant. As it turned out, the Emperor's power in this state was not absolute at all. There was a special order of magicians created as a counterweight to the secular authorities, and their cooperation helped maintain peace. And the sorcerers from the tower were absolutely untouchable. New members were recruited only once every 20 years, so even the eldest heir could not order the killing of one of the neophytes or adult wizards. In previous lives, Orinda had never even dreamed of gaining such power, but she still didn't understand why, out of all the possible candidates, Luke was targeting her. With a cheerful grin, Oscar explained that the tower needed people like Maleficent. Otherwise, the current head of the order had fallen ill, and since then there was no one to quarrel with the Emperor. But this was the only entertainment for the wizards in the tower, and now, until the supreme leader returns to normal, gray boredom and mortal despondency reign there. Both Orinda and Noah were stunned by the fact that the young magician seriously used such a petty and ridiculous pretext, and then the blonde reminded them that by entering the tower, the brunette would remain alive even if her entire family was hanged on the gallows and the lands were burned and sprinkled with salt. The former dugout found herself in deep thought. On the one hand, if she accepted this offer, the familiar plot would finally go downhill, and she would lose the main advantage in the form of knowledge of future events. But on the other hand, it would provide reliable protection from the Edmund's revenge. Living to a ripe old age, breathing deeply, and not fearing getting a knife in the back every second, all this sounded incredibly attractive to the time traveler. After careful consideration, she decided that the benefits far outweighed the drawbacks and decisively agreed to the partnership and admission. Oscar smiled, extended his hand to the protagonist, and made a formal vow. If they were study partners for the next 3 years, he would grant Maleficent membership in the tower. The brunette looked away for a few seconds, saw a shocked and slightly frightened Noah, and with even greater determination declared, yes, now she will be able to cheat fate itself. Now the magical contract between the two young people was officially concluded, and only after that Luke playfully reminded that the protection works both ways. Magicians have no right to attack members of the ruling family. A purple pentagram reminiscent of demonic summoning circles began to glow under the feet of the young wizards, and Orinda finally decided to turn to her hated fiancé. Now she had no right to take revenge on him or even do anything nasty, but that was okay. Instead, Maleficent would sincerely pray that Noah Hensley von Edmund himself would die one day. After that, both she and Oscar disappeared in a flash of light to the impotent fury of the young prince. Only a barely noticeable purple haze remained to indicate their presence. However, the brunette could have been at least partly consoled by the fact that after this, the main characters caught the eye of the strict teacher. She was very outraged by the tardiness and violation of the academy rules on the use of charms. What's even funnier is that they weren't thrown into a corridor or an outside park or anywhere else, but straight into the auditorium, so dozens of people were staring at the two offenders in shock. The outcome was exactly what could have been expected. The young man and woman were once again sentenced to a difficult and humiliating run around the stadium, and Arinda, suffering and sweating, asked, "Does Oscar really just hate her?" The gray-haired man, feigning offense, reminded him that he couldn't say that because now they were fellow students and guildmates, and Maleficent finally exploded with indignation. She screamed, "Why did he set them both up like that then?" Because of the screams and anger, the brunette lost her rhythm. She awkwardly placed her foot and fell on her knee, and only Luke's help prevented the protagonist from falling face down in the grass. With his ever-present grin, he advised them to be careful and then innocently explained that they had to go to the auditorium anyway, so the shortest and easiest route had been chosen. The traveler rolled her eyes tiredly and sighed. It was incredibly difficult for her now to believe that this grown-up child was the future head of the greatest order of sorcerers. Oscar then asked why Arinda was suffering for real instead of just using magic like she did when she met Reynold, but Maleficent refused to explain or cheat, and so she ended up feeling half dead while the blonde sat there as if nothing had happened. Eleanor was already hurrying towards them. Just like last time, she had prepared a handkerchief for her best friend, and the protagonist was happier to receive it than the prospector was to receive a huge gold nugget. And then the ill-fated teacher appeared. Pathetically adjusting her glasses, she began to read a speech on the topic of how everyone is equal in the academy, and that they do not distinguish between kings, dukes, and commoners. The traveler nodded sadly, feigning attentiveness. She had heard these words several times in previous timelines, but then, however, running had been much harder. When one of the mentors appeared on the horizon, Luke immediately changed. The relaxation disappeared from his posture. He began to breathe heavily, and his whole appearance demonstrated how much the punishment had exhausted him. And this really angered the main character. Of the two of them, only she was actually working off the fine, and this crook was now putting on a hypocritical show. That's why the protagonist, without any pity, told the teacher that the gray-haired man secretly used a charm, and this was the first time Oscar was afraid of something. As it turned out, this was the reason why Arinda did not want to use magic. She wanted to take revenge on the trickster for his annoying antics and obsessions so much that she was ready to endure terrible fatigue and pain. While the teacher scolded him and sentenced him to run 5 laps around the huge stadium, the teenager tried to attract Maleficent's attention and get help, but she only gave him the most affectionate and mocking grin possible. And no, the newcomer had absolutely no sympathy for her new partner. She believed that he got away with all his antics too often, so punishment would only be beneficial, and therefore focused on talking to Serena. As it turned out, Eleanor was very worried about her relationship with Maleficent. It seemed to her that she herself was too intrusive, essentially forcing the brunette to communicate with her. The protagonist listened to this with her mouth open and her eyes wide open. She couldn't believe that this sweet little son could think such nasty things about herself. That's why she tried very ardently and fiercely to convince the blonde that everything was fine, like a lover comforting her dearest person after a hard day. The blonde was genuinely surprised by such a reaction, but then she smiled sweetly and admitted that she also liked Arinda and did not regret their acquaintance. The main character was so embarrassed by this simple and harmless confession that she abruptly turned away and went somewhere, dragging the bewildered Eleanor along with her. Serena tried to find out what thought had come into Maleficent's head again, but she refused to reveal the surprise. She only winked playfully and smiled. As it quickly turned out, the protagonist decided to use the classic approach to courtship. She took her new friend to the nearest bakery and ordered the most delicious dishes. It ended awkwardly, though. Arinda walked back to the academy with a huge bag filled to the brim with buns and bread, and Eleanor complained out loud that she had asked a stupid question. The blonde also wanted to share food with Oscar because the poor guy had already suffered enough at the stadium, but the brunette flatly refused. She certainly did not feel any romantic attraction to him. Then the empath reminded that Luke, no matter who he was, remained Maleficent's partner, which meant they had to show some kind of care for each other. In response, the young Duchess only sighed heavily and admitted that from the very beginning she wanted to form an alliance with Serena, but the young sorcerer ruined everything. She, however, hypocritically did not want to admit that the offer of the gray-haired guy was much more tempting and profitable. No matter how you look at it, the absolute shield against Noah was just what you needed. Eleanor also felt this hesitation and therefore softly but firmly stated that if the protagonist had wanted their union so much, she would have said so on the very first day, but in the end she still chose Oscar. The empath added that a missed opportunity never comes back, as if she were a wise old woman teaching her ignorant granddaughter about life. Arinda looked at this with her eyes wide open in surprise. What she certainly didn't expect was such a retort from the meek and gentle Serena. She still didn't understand how all this related to the need to feed Luke with her own money, but in the end she decided not to continue the argument and back down. Eleanor then shocked the Duchess with the news that the rest of Class A couldn't stand them for some reason, so it would be better if the three of them formed their own group. She didn't have time to develop this topic. Reynold Watson suddenly appeared right in front of the girls, as always cold and stern, and Arinda hurried to greet him. For a few seconds the young knight stared at the heroine, and then very slowly and awkwardly waved back at her. But it looked so unnatural that the protagonist suspected the guy was a robot. Having closed the distance, Maleficent asked the newly minted trainer how he felt after another session with the blade, and whether he would like a snack to restore his strength. She also tried very awkwardly to apologize for the actions of that crazy guy, meaning Luke Oscar, but as it turned out the guys already knew each other. Feeling how his tongue was awkwardly wagging, turning the harmonious words into some kind of absurd mumbling, the brunette asked if the redhead was very angry, and Reynolds simply answered, yes. But he was, of course, not angry at the girl, so she didn't have to apologize for the actions of another person, and as a sign of this, the boy allowed himself to smile. Besides, Watson felt no less guilty, because he had insisted too much on fencing lessons and decided to apologize for it. Pleased that everything had been resolved in the most peaceful way, the newcomer shook Reynolds' hand and assured him that in any case she was glad of their meetings, and the boy, slightly embarrassed, agreed, although he continued to think that Arinda's refusal of the sword was a monstrous waste of talents. It was a small but real victory. The former Earthling managed to get a little closer to one of her favorite heroes and was already going to share this with Serena. However, she didn't have time. Eleanor approached the young knight holding a large bag of purchased buns in her hands and kindly offered to satisfy his hunger with them. After this, there is another tiny time skip, and the audience is shown a close-up of Luke's outraged, almost tear-stained face, accusing Maleficent of betrayal. Instead of answering, the brunette took a large piece of bread and shoved it down the young wizard's throat. She didn't even deign to turn around, she didn't care so much. The gray-haired teenager chewed it up and swallowed it very quickly, and then, not at all embarrassed by the indifference, continued to whine to his new partner about his problems. But what angered Oscar most was not even this, but Reynolds' presence at the table. He even unceremoniously pointed his finger at him and asked, "What is this guy doing here?" The protagonist, sweating from his angry gaze, tried to awkwardly joke, like she will be a wolf, a wizard, and a swordsman, and to which camp is this definition closer? Watson, of course, declared it closer to swordsman due to the two syllables in common. Serena pointed out that Nick was in both words, and Luke simply rolled his eyes, theatrically complaining about having to deal with such an audience. Someone else would have been offended by this, but the empath just smiled happily and carefreely replied that they didn't have any other friends here anyway. That is the saying about being without fish applies. Oscar indignantly declared that he was not going to be friends with Watson, and Arinda, unable to restrain herself, began to coo mockingly, like what kindergarten our little boy doesn't want to be friends, oops. But she could tease and be sarcastic as much as she wanted, but in reality Maleficent was happy. For the first time in her life, she found real friends with whom she could just sit at the same table and fool around, and without that nasty Noah. It was ordinary human happiness, but it was precisely this that now made the newcomer laugh and smile heartily without worrying about tomorrow. Suddenly, Luke looked very intently and irritably straight at the main character, and she became worried. Had she really gone too far in her ridicule and offended the guy? But it turned out that the young man was simply continuing to sulk about that setup at the stadium, so he firmly stated that all these smiles would not help. He was still angry. Such a petty reason made Arinda laugh, and when Oscar asked what kind she needed, the protagonist half-jokingly and half-seriously said, "So that you feel bad when I smile." As the narrator explained, it was much more than just a sarcastic jab. That's what the High Prince Noah had told her in one of her past lives. Edmund's mood was spoiled when he saw his unloved bride smile no matter what the reason, and hearing this, the time traveler only miraculously retained her composure. And now she decided to replay the situation with Oscar, the least favorite of her new acquaintances, but unlike her, the young wizard took it with humor. But he quickly wiped the grin off his face, crossed his arms over his chest, and declared that he was still angry. After all, running kilometers on all fours is not easy at all. At this point, Reynold entered the conversation, declaring that it was a piece of cake, provided that you trained regularly and diligently, and the time traveler realized that things were heading towards another argument. And so of course it happened a second later. Looking intently at Watson, Luke said with an exaggeratedly surprised look, Oh, we have a slowpoke here." Not wanting to listen to another session of swearing between the men, Arinda simply pinched the gray-haired man on the side with such force that he screamed throughout the dining room. While the young sorcerer was cradling the injured area, the women remembered that the Academy's management was planning to hold a special dance evening this weekend. This was no ordinary ball, but a special event, a sort of second welcoming ceremony for the freshmen, and Eleanor would have been very happy to attend it. Reynold didn't understand what the point of doing something like this was, and Serena explained that they would be studying for 3 years, and during that time they would have almost no opportunity to meet students from other groups, so this was a kind of compensation. In reality, of course, everything was much simpler. The author came up with this ball as a template but beautiful way to unite Edmund with the blonde, starting their love story. Watson, meanwhile, was completely disheartened. Not afraid of training with weapons and grueling runs across a huge field, he was very afraid of being disgraced because of his inability to dance. Luke, of course, couldn't miss such an opportunity to tease his hated rival, and the atmosphere instantly grew heavier. The guys hadn't yet stooped to direct insults, but there was still an aura of threat in the air, like when two wolves were fighting. The protagonist watched this with a bored look. She knew perfectly well that they both danced very badly, but she would rather die than admit it to each other. Reynold was the first to leave the table, and the brunette also decided to take her leave, but Oscar stopped her. The sorcerer was interested in whether the main character danced well. Arinda snapped back that she was definitely doing it better than Luke, but she was actually concerned about this strange interest, and the teenager grinned and asked, "Do you remember who your partner is?" Indignant, she demanded that this not be mentioned. They allegedly entered into an agreement against her will. And then the young man reminded that Maleficent owed him a favor, so why not return it through dance training? The time traveler found herself backed against the wall and decided to agree, clearly believing that nothing terrible would happen anyway. But she underestimated Luke's lack of talent. He danced terribly regularly, stepping on his partner's feet. The offended wizard tried to blame Arinda for simply not knowing how to do it right, but Serena, who was watching their torment, confirmed that the protagonist was right. Oscar simply had bad technique. While they continued their studies, the former Earthling directly asked why the young magician had asked to study if he couldn't stand criticism, and the blonde calmly explained that he wanted to become better than Watson, and he also hoped to have some fun. Hearing this, Maleficent was ready to give up and stop, but the young man returned her motivation, promising to teach her some unique spells that only members of the tower possess, and they can be used to take revenge on enemies. After the main character agreed to one more final tryout, everything changed dramatically. The guy began to dance so skillfully and beautifully, as if he had been learning this since birth. The protagonist immediately realized that this was too unnatural, that it was impossible to learn something like this on the first day, but she did not have time to question the young sorcerer. He decided to leave immediately after the end of the classes. After a while, the audience is shown how the main characters are looking for clothes for the upcoming ball. Arinda grumbled that there was nothing suitable anywhere, and they even skipped lunch for the chance to quickly find something original and attractive. Serena tried to console her friend, assuring her that the appearance of the clothes didn't really matter. The main thing was that they fit well, but it was just after that that the girls finally got lucky. Beaming with delight, Maleficent solemnly pulled out from the bins a very beautiful and bright blue and white dress that seemed to have been created for a Disney film about a princess. It was this outfit that Eleanor wore every year for the gala balls in the novel, but then Orinda remembered that it was the same one that attracted Noah's attention, and she abruptly changed her mind about giving it to the blonde. Unfortunately, it was too late to hide it. Serena really liked this thing, and she firmly decided to go in it, and she also noticed that there were no suitable styles for the main character. Naturally, the time traveler had a pre-planned plan for such a case, and after a short time skip, viewers are shown how the guests at that very ball are whispering in surprise, looking at someone. It was Orinda Maleficent, and instead of a dress, she wore a man's tailcoat. On modern Earth, this would not have caused any reaction, but in the local near-medieval world, other values were in effect, and dozens of guests stared at the Duchess, their mouths open in shock. The protagonist, of course, understood perfectly well that, from the locals' point of view, she looked like some kind of abnormal transvestite, but she didn't care at all. She even angrily stared at those who whispered too loudly. But then a new participant appeared on the stage, the main character's brother William, and now he decided to take on the role of a strict older relative, scolding his dim-witted little sister. He was truly outraged by Orinda's unconventional choice of wardrobe, but she still didn't care. She reasonably reminded her unloved little brother that he usually didn't care about her. In order not to listen to his boring and frankly hypocritical whining for hours, the former dug out feigned remorse, pressed her hand to her heart, and read a heart-stirring speech herself. Behind all his beautiful and lyrical words there was an unambiguous order to go to hell and not interfere. And Will understood this perfectly well because he was terribly angry. Feeling steam coming out of his ears, the young man threatened to complain to his father about such unworthy behavior, and almost fell off his feet when he heard that the main character had sent him away long ago. Before he could say anything else, Serena walked onto the stage wearing that same sky-blue dress, and the two friends lovingly held hands and showered each other with compliments. They would have happily cooed like this all evening like two lovebirds, but then Eleanor turned her attention to someone else, and the younger Maleficent's face darkened. William, of course, didn't go anywhere. He was going to continue to nag at his sister's bald spot, but as soon as he saw the blonde, his jaw dropped to the floor from such beauty. Having come to his senses, he changed dramatically. Now the brunette seemed to be the embodiment of gallantry and politeness, so much did he want to attract Eleanor and sleep with her. The protagonist looked at this display of hypocrisy and lust with disgust and disdain, and the empath was clearly alarmed. But she still did not show her true emotions, and even managed to politely greet this lady's man. William immediately noted that Serena was close to our Orinda, which made the heroine swear quietly and casually asked if there were any problems with her. Having assured the aristocrat that everything was fine, the blonde glanced sideways. Onlookers had already crowded around the three of them and were openly discussing the unfolding performance. But that was exactly what the girl needed. Without trying to lower her voice, she declared to Will that his sister was a wonderful person. She even apologized for his attempts to stalk and flirt with her because the young bastard himself ran away before Eleanor had a chance to scold him. Fortunately, at the ball, she finally had the opportunity to express what had been simmering, and at the end, the empath expressed the hope that the brunette would never allow himself to repeat such mistakes again. Young Maleficent turned terribly purple, and his words turned into an inarticulate wheeze, but the blonde calmly repeated how sorry she felt for her friend, forced to take responsibility for her brother's actions, and that he would act like a gentleman if he left the girls alone forever. Immediately after this, Serena took the protagonist by the arm and decisively led her away, but the brunette managed to mockingly stick out her tongue at the hated and humiliated relative. A few minutes later, Eleanor, blushing and putting her hand to her chest, admitted that it was very difficult for her to do this. She was afraid that the enraged guy would take revenge on her sister, but Orinda proudly assured her friend that she did the right thing. While the time traveler was enjoying a piece of cake, the empath couldn't resist asking the question that had been tormenting so many local people. Why was a tailcoat chosen out of all the available options? The answer was predictable. The young duchess was so attracted to the blonde that she wanted to dance with her at any cost, and if that meant putting on men's clothes, then so be it. But interestingly, this was only part of the truth. While the protagonists were enjoying dessert, Maleficent admitted in her thoughts that there was another reason for such a strange decision. While the guests walked calmly through the luxurious hall, chatting with each other and enjoying the buffet, the narrator reminded the readers that the engagement of Orinda and Noah was a well-known fact and an important event for the empire. That is why they would be the first dancing couple symbolizing the opening of the ball, and the newcomer did not want to meet Hensley again to such an extent that she was ready to go to any eccentricity. It was at this moment that the prince appeared on the scene again, and the former earthling realized that a thunderstorm was about to begin. So that Serena would not be hit, she sent her away under a plausible pretext. The red-eyed brunette said nothing for the first few seconds before squeezing out the phrase, "interesting outfit," but he didn't even try to hide his disgust. Edmund immediately assumed that the main character dressed like that because she desperately didn't want to have any extra contact with him, and Orinda thought irritably, "That's right, idiot." Continuing to look at her as if she were some kind of strange animal, the young man added that he didn't even know why Maleficent had taken such desperate measures. After all, they were now inviolable for each other, so the Duchess had absolutely nothing to fear. But for some reason she recoiled from the outstretched hand, as if she had seen a vile viper. Noah still caught a strand of the newcomer's hair and stroked it gently, admitting that he would like to use this chance, since the protagonist already desperately wants to break off their engagement. But it wasn't a matter of emotion, of course. It was just that Hensley, no matter how you felt about him, was raised as a politician, and he would very much like to use Orinda to promote good relations between the Tower's sorcerers and the crown. Realizing that she was going to be used like some kind of scarecrow, the newcomer's eyes widened and she gnashed her teeth. But fortunately, she didn't have to do anything. Oscar crept up behind Edmund, and without any respect put his arms around his neck, declaring that if that was the case, he would be a much more suitable candidate for the prince. The frightened prince squealed, asking what Luke was even allowing himself to do, and the gray-haired trickster carelessly replied that he was mocking the future emperor as a future archmage. But then he looked very eloquently at the stunned protagonist, as if silently telling her, "Don't worry, partner, I won't let this puppy ruin your evening." Still holding the brunette by the shoulders, the young wizard seductively whispered that he knew one good dance that they could try, and Noah desperately reminded him that they were both guys, and this was all some kind of nonsense. Oscar replied carelessly that if His Highness was embarrassed by this, then he would simply put on a dress. And Orinda, unable to bear it, turned away and quietly cried, filled with incredible respect for her partner's selflessness. A few minutes passed. The youngest Maleficent jumped out of the hall onto the balcony and was now desperately trying to catch her breath, thinking about the fact that another plot thread had completely gone haywire. Here someone quietly called the main character by name. Looking up, she saw Reynold in a similar black and white suit and very awkwardly rubbing his neck. The young knight admitted with embarrassment that he simply didn't like such places, and then Luke actually conjured up a woman's dress for himself and dragged Hensley into a dance, turning the ceremony into some kind of circus. The protagonist treated this reason for escaping from the hall with sincere understanding, and for some time the main characters simply looked at the night sky until Watson mentioned that he had indeed taken dance courses. He really wanted to wipe the nose of the self-confident Oscar, but now that the sorcerer was busy with something completely different, the red-haired teenager wanted Orinda to appreciate his skills. He did not try to seduce or persuade as William or Von Edmund would have done, but simply extended his hand and briefly offered to dance once. The main character blushed noticeably again, as if she had just visited a bathhouse, after which she timidly placed her hand in Reynold's strong palm and responded with consent. After this, readers are shown the interior of the palace where the ball is held. All those present had already dispersed into couples and were moving elegantly to the sounds of the melody. Among them were the main characters. Trying to find a common rhythm with Watson, Maleficent asked how he learned it, and the boy admitted that he listened to a fencing teacher. This man, of course, was among the visitors. He watched his favorite pupil for a long time and without stopping, and had such a proud look as if Watson were his son who had won a glorious victory. True, one nuance soon came to light. The man taught Reynold to dance as well as to wield a blade, so the protagonists did not so much move as rush around the room, almost knocking people down along with the furniture. When the music ended and the time came for the gentlemen to kiss the hands of their chosen ones, the young knight took the brunette by the hand and embarrassedly admitted that he probably had not moved very well due to inexperience. But he was still very glad that the young duchess had responded to his proposal with consent, and he gently touched his palm with her forehead, causing the traveler to blush again. The former earthling couldn't believe that she was communicating with the same Reynold Watson from the book. He had never been so emotional and smiling. He was definitely a different person who had stolen the guise of her favorite. True, after this, he left the hall citing the need to go to bed early, and Arinda decided to go to rest. This crazy waltz had sucked all the strength out of her. But then Luke Oscar appeared right in front of her. The gray-haired youth was so indignant that he turned purple and puffed angrily like an old car engine. The young wizard simply could not believe that the protagonist had betrayed him once again. After all, he wanted to be the first to dance with her as her official study partner. In response, the brunette smiled very sweetly and innocently asked, hadn't the princess herself announced the beginning of the ball when she started dancing with the eldest prince? Plus, Arinda is still wearing a tailcoat, so their tandem could be misunderstood, but she'd be happy to accept Oscar's offer if he conjures up a dress for himself again. Most people would have been put off by this, no doubt, but not this silver-haired trickster. He smirked back, placed a coquettish hand on the back of his head, and asked if he should wear a more extravagant outfit. The former earthling sighed heavily and tiredly. She now realized that it was practically impossible to defeat Luke with his favorite weapon, so she obediently extended her hand and offered to go on stage. While dancing leisurely with the girl, the young wizard casually asked if he was better than Reynold in this regard, and the protagonist very evasively answered that you can't compare a beginner with an expert. And then she sincerely thanked him for that trick with Noah. Maleficent was very afraid that she would not be able to bear it and would break down, thereby giving the hated prince a moral victory. Laughing good-naturedly, Oscar chided the main character for leaving too early, not being able to enjoy the sight of Hensley's face distorted with animal rage. Continuing to perform graceful movements to the beat of the music, the girl once again asked why Luke wanted to take her as a partner, and the guy again avoided answering, saying that reasons were not required given their relationship. The former dugout retorted that this was precisely the question that worried her, their strange relationship, after which the gray-haired teenager, with theatrical sadness, accused his partner of heartlessness. The time traveler reminded that an ordinary person, even the most altruistic one, would never disgrace himself by putting on a woman's dress and dancing with a man for the sake of an ordinary friend whom he had known for a week at most. But the young man simply replied that it was natural for him with his reputation. Feeling growing despair, the protagonist called her partner by his first and last name, and he, looking away, asked a rhetorical question. Does it mean that his feelings for Arinda are not serious if they have not known each other for long? In the end, he simply said that he liked Maleficent as a person, and that she was of general interest, and the main character gave in. It was as if she was trying to get a wall to talk. At this point, Serena returned to the stage, and Luke waved at her in a friendly manner, while turning to the young Duchess with the words, "How about you trust your partner for once?" After this, the gray-haired teenager decided to take his leave with his eternal good-natured grin, warning the main character that they would see each other tomorrow in class during lessons. Then the friends started exchanging news. As it turned out, Eleanor, too, to her misfortune, saw that terrible dance between the guys, and even she realized that Noah left furious after that. The protagonist was genuinely pleased by this, but not only because of her gloating. Oscar's prank led to the prince and the blonde not meeting at the ball, as was the case in the book. In this timeline, everything was going as well as possible. Von Edmund was unable to charm Serena by dancing with her, and Maleficent did not have to endure his presence, so the delighted girls decided to grab some goodies and go relax in the dorm. The action moves to the next day during a history lesson. While the teacher was telling the students about the development of the empire, the narrator explained to the audience what impression the stars of the recent ball made on those around them. And by stars, in this case, of course, they meant Noah Hensley and Luke Oscar. The latter, for his antics with a woman's dress, has already begun to be called the lover of the heir to the throne. No matter how self-confident the young wizard seemed, that event did not pass without a trace for him. He became a laughing stock for everyone else, and even the mentor could not resist teasing him about yesterday's dance. The former Earthling also did not stand aside. She even secretly threw the young man a piece of paper with a mocking inscription during class. "What is it like to be the lover of the Crown Prince?" Instead of answering, the young wizard crumpled the piece of paper and threw it into the trash can. He belonged to that breed of people who were ready to laugh as much as they wanted at others, but did not tolerate jokes at their own expense. He even showed the protagonist a gesture that translates as, "I will definitely remember this and return the favor," but it didn't come to a squabble thanks to the teacher. She sternly called out to Orinda Maleficent, and the brunette obediently rose from her chair, mentally preparing to answer some kind of teeth-grinding question. And so it was. With a sly gleam in her eyes, the woman asked what the name of the commander of the punitive detachment of the Empire of past centuries was, believing that the protagonist would definitely not say it. A deathly silence fell over the entire classroom as the young Duchess, without a second's hesitation, answered that the man was Eric Nod Saya. Having overcome the shock, the mentor confirmed that the answer was correct and added that although Eric did not obey the orders of his superiors in this way, he saved many lives. After that, Serena quietly asked how her friend could have found out about this, since the question was clearly a trick question, and the newcomer awkwardly joked it off, reminding her that repetition is the mother of learning. Technically, it wasn't even a lie, because Orinda remembered the answers she needed from her 2 previous lives, and after the lesson was over, Luke approached her with an offer to study in her free time. Oscar had promised that he would teach the girl unique spells from the tower, so he had to keep his word, but he was sulking so cartoonishly that Maleficent couldn't help but roll her eyes. After their quartet of friends had already entered the corridor, the main character asked what exactly the young wizard was going to teach her, and Reynold, who was walking ahead, immediately became wary. Wanting to annoy him, the young trickster familiarly hugged the protagonist by the shoulders and lied that he also knew a little about swordplay, and so he demonstrated his tricks to the Duchess. But this time the trick didn't work. Watson, no matter how straightforward a person he was, didn't fall for such an obvious pretext and simply stated that he didn't believe Luke. Trying to somehow regain face, Oscar admitted that he planned to instead teach Orinda to throw meteorites pulled from the sky at the enemy, and this even caused a restrained "wow" from those around him. The main character, tired of all these pranks and jokes, simply asked the young wizard to at least sometimes tell the truth, and the offended guy said that he should be trusted unconditionally. This is the basis of their relationship. In response, the protagonist seriously said that Luke had not inspired her trust from the very first day, so since when should she blindly take their word for it now? And Reynold nodded in agreement. The angry teenager, puffing like a teapot, was indignant. How dare they treat the future supreme mage like that? Are they not afraid at all? And the main character very mockingly drawled, "Yeah, I'm rushing to fall at your feet and beg for mercy." However, none of this was a serious insult. The 4 friends walked calmly side by side, quietly bickering, laughing at each other, but that's all. The main characters chose a large empty auditorium as their training ground, where Oscar, becoming serious for the first time, explained to the newcomer that she didn't have much mana, but he would still unlock her potential. When asked how exactly, the young trickster explained with a grin that the method was very simple. Maleficent would simply have to release all the magical energy that was present in her body. Orinda admitted that she already knows how to use some spells, but knows nothing about how to sense their source, but this did not surprise Luke. The tower's mages guard this secret like watchdogs. To make it easier for the girl to understand what was required of her, the guy created a ball of gentle bluish glow in his hand and asked her to imagine how all the power accumulated in her chest. The protagonist obediently closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and concentrated, trying to follow the instructions, and the young mentor praised her, encouraging her to continue in the same spirit. This was one of the few times when Oscar didn't try to play the fool. He was very attentive to every change in Orinda's aura and assured her that even if she began to lose strength, she had to endure it, and he would ensure her in case of failure. This is exactly what happened in the end. The newcomer quickly felt how her entire body was enveloped in heat, how it was rapidly weakening, and how a blissful emptiness reigned in her head. From the girl's point of view, it only lasted a few moments, but in reality some time passed, and it wasn't a very good time. Luke grabbed Maleficent by the shoulders, ordering her to stop immediately, and Serena looked scared. No, the main character did not hurt anyone or destroy anything, but her own body suffered noticeable damage. Her once black hair turned completely white and now resembled white ribbons. In another situation, Orinda might have exploded from indignation and fear, but now she was simply too weak for that. She was noticeably swaying so that her friends were even afraid whether she would be able to even stand without help. But the protagonist quickly assured them that she felt completely normal. Her head was ringing and her senses were noticeably heightened, but otherwise there were no problems. To lighten the mood, Maleficent tried to laugh it off by asking for a mirror to check her appearance. But Oscar, of all people, didn't appreciate the joke. He was so scared by what had happened. Eleanor asked again if everything was really okay with her friend, and Orinda confirmed that yes, everything was fine and she was just feeling a little sleepy, that's all. After this, Luke suddenly picked her up and explained that the Duchess really needed to rest. She had released too much energy. Because of this, her body was exhausted. In another situation, the girl would most likely have been indignant and demanded to be let go. But after her feigned bravado, the fatigue from the unsuccessful experiment came like a tsunami. After some time, she woke up in bed. Her hair had turned black again, but she was brought back to life by the feeling that even the bed linen was very hard and trying to cause pain. The protagonist jumped up too abruptly, as if a huge bell had rung above her, so Luke gently but persistently pressed on her shoulders, urging her to lie down again, and Serena hastened to ask how she was feeling. They were not in one of the dormitory bedrooms as one might have thought, but in the medical center, and there was no doctor nearby because Oscar assured him that he could handle the problem himself. Taking advantage of the opportunity, the main character asked the mentor why this happened at all, and the young sorcerer explained, the body could not withstand the load of mana, so the hair turned gray, and now Maleficent was still too weak, and with unstable mana, so she needed rest. But what's most interesting is that this was not an ordinary case. Each person has their own limit, and the body automatically blocks the flow of magic when it goes beyond it. But Orinda, as practice showed, did not have this very limit, and the girl, not believing her ears, asked again, does she really have an endless supply of witchcraft power? But the future Archmage warned her not to be too happy about it. In practice, it doesn't really matter how much mana you have, whether it's a river or an entire ocean, because the body won't withstand too much stress anyway. He gave hair as an example. Just recently, it was white like snow because the body did not have the strength for pigmentation. But what will happen next? Will the internal organs fail? While saying all this, Oscar did not joke or smile, which sincerely struck the girl, but it also made her take the problem seriously and think about finding some kind of golden mean. Luke wearily replied that this was of course wonderful, but Orinda now only needed to rest and nothing more, so the brunette, even more tired, gave in. In the next shot, the audience is shown the protagonist trudging sadly to class, loudly complaining about her hard lot. Studying and working after a short break was incredibly difficult. It turned out that her partner had gotten her a 5-day sick leave. Maleficent had no idea how he had managed to do this without revealing to the director that they were violating the ban on using magic at the academy, but the fact remained a fact. But now the blissful time of idleness and bed rest had come to an end, and it was necessary to dive headlong into learning again, which caused the unfortunate woman bitter tears and gnashing of teeth. Luckily, she had a best friend in Serena Eleanor, who was able to sweeten this suffering a little. The blonde collected notes from all the lessons that the girl missed. The time traveler didn't really need this because thanks to her photographic memory and previous timelines, she already knew everything, but the very fact of such care moved her to tears. From an excess of emotions, she literally squeezed the empath in a bear hug and would have cried on her shoulder for a long time if Oscar had not intervened, pulling the girls apart with a disgruntled question, "What's with the passions this morning?" The protagonist greeted her partner politely, and he, horrified, asked her not to act so uncharacteristically. It was scary. And when he heard that he himself had previously asked her to show him more politeness, he simply replied, "Oh, right." Digging into his pocket, the silver-haired youth pulled out a glowing purple crystal on a chain. This artifact was created as a restraining mechanism that would cut off Maleficent's mana supply if her body was pushed to its limits again. It was a very difficult, literally delicate job, but Luke coped with it. He was, after all, a child prodigy in terms of everything related to magic, and he was destined to become the youngest archmage in history. Serena also helped, donating her own mana to the work of spells and risking her health for the sake of her friend, and this delighted Orinda so much that she instantly forgot about poor Oscar staring at the blonde with a loving look. The discouraged wizard tried to remind her that he had also made an amulet, but the brunette didn't care at all. She was only squeezing her beloved and would have continued doing so for a long time if not for Reynolds' arrival. Watson heard rumors that the protagonist was very ill, and he was so worried that he took the time to visit her at the first opportunity. Having made sure that she now felt great, the young knight breathed a sigh of relief and advised her to train more because sports strengthen the immune system. The former Earthling was mentally prepared for the guys to start arguing with each other again, but what she didn't expect was that Luke would agree with Reynolds. It was easier to believe that the sky was falling to Earth. Oscar added seriously that a stronger body works better with more mana, so Maleficent should focus on improving her health, and this made her even more upset. Deciding that the young Duchess was horrified by the thought of being driven around the field from morning until night, Watson hastened to add that nothing of the sort would happen, no extra work. And before the girl had time to rejoice, the knight brought her down to earth, declaring that they would be better off starting with a trifle in the form of 5 laps around the stadium. And for a house mouse like Orinda, this was already hellish torment. And Luke, of course, did not miss the opportunity to take revenge for that old setup with the teacher. He maliciously informed that he would be very careful to ensure that the heroine did not use magic or cheat in class. Realizing that she was cornered, the protagonist decided to confess to Reynolds that she used magic at their first meeting, but as it turned out he had already found out about it, from the well-known gray-haired trickster. This, however, did not frighten the newcomer, but on the contrary made her look at Watson with the same loving gaze as she had earlier at Serena. After all, he was a well-known hater of liars and cheaters, but he found the strength to forgive Orinda. But then this beautiful moment was hopelessly ruined. Realizing that there was very little time left before the start of classes, the young knight ordered 3 laps to be completed today, and full classes would begin early tomorrow morning, and all of Maleficent's pleas went in one ear and out the other. The red-haired guy grabbed the protagonist by the hand and dragged her towards the exit. She desperately tried to convince him that she would not be able to attend classes because of the sweat, but Luke destroyed her last hope, promising to solve this problem with charms. After a short time, skip viewers are shown the time traveler after these classes. She felt half dead, and this is only after 3 laps, not the promised 5. Serena, who supported this idea, guiltily explained that it was also good for mages to have good health, so it was for Arianda's benefit, and she mentally forgave Eleanor because she was very cute. Then came the hour of unscheduled tests conducted by the same teacher in glasses, and the teenagers groaned in horror, and it was hard to say what frightened them more, the type of classes themselves or the personality of the teacher. According to the terms of the task, it was necessary to write and supplement the formulas for the barrier, the dividing space, and the spells that cause time fluctuations, but the result at least did not affect the grade, but simply helped to assess the overall potential of the students. While the woman was performing the spell, dozens of young people clutched their heads, and they could be understood because they first-year students were given a task of the highest level of difficulty. The protagonist, of course, knew the right answers, but for some time thought about hiding it so as not to stand out. However, she abandoned this idea in order to enter the tower. After class, the main character and Oscar were left behind after class. Rachel once again reminded them that even though the brunette comes from a great family, she won't get away with such things here. Looking intently at the newcomer through translucent glasses, the mentor said that if the young Duchess had a conscience, she should confess to what she had done. The former Earthling, either sincerely or for cover, replied that she had no idea what the teacher was accusing her of, but Rachel was not at all impressed. Realizing that the conversation was about that unfortunate test, the girl tried to prove that she hadn't copied anything, but the teacher only chuckled with satisfaction. Like since she was the first to talk about it, it meant she was guilty. However, the brunette's nerves were much stronger than one might think. She calmly lied that she came to this conclusion from the consideration that the professor who was not responsible for their class could only call them about recent classes. The atmosphere suddenly became tense, as if this was not a dispute over a test, but at least a duel to the death, and Luke, unable to contain himself, giggled at how ridiculous it looked from the outside. What amused him most was that no matter what the circumstances, Maleficent refused to bend, but she simply poked him in the side with her elbow. Rachel explained that Oscar Arinda's official partner was the only person in the class who had the knowledge to pass the assignment correctly, and the brunette barely passed the entrance exam, so how could she not suspect cheating? The real young Duchess was indeed a very poor student. Even the girl who had entered her body, looking at the report card that was handed to her, could not help but wonder how such a bungler had been allowed into the academy at all. The teacher triumphantly added that the puzzle was coming together too well. The girl probably just copied the guy or persuaded him to help her. The heroine tried to remind him that the mentor used special charms to track attempts to cheat, but the woman retorted that with Oscar's help, they were easy to bypass. Realizing that she had no arguments left, the protagonist turned to Luke for help, and he pretended that he didn't give a damn about his partner, that she annoyed him too much to care about her like that. But even this failed to convince the persistent teacher. She reminded him that the gray-haired man was a famous joker, so she needed real evidence, not words. Desperate, Arinda suggested that they just give her the chance to take the test again, but then a cold voice came from the room saying, "Well, it looks like my fiancé is in trouble." It was, of course, Noah Hensley von Edmund. The Crown Prince explained that he had heard someone scolding his betrothed, and he had decided to see what was going on and help prove her innocence. The red-eyed teenager noted that Maleficent had always had a talent for the magical arts, but she did not develop it until entering the academy, because it was not required for the future ruler of the empire. Even though Rachel respected the man, she was still going to challenge these arguments, but she failed. The prince quickly added that he had seen Arinda use a paralysis spell on a man. Realizing that she was now backed into a corner, the teacher used her last argument. She said that Noah could simply be lying to save the reputation of his fiancé. In response to this, Noah Hensley simply said, "I swear by the Emperor," as if this were an irrefutable argument that could instantly end any argument. Apparently, at least partly, this was true. At the very least, a dead silence reigned in the audience, and everyone present stared at the heir to the throne in deep shock. The exhibition revealed that this was indeed a magical oath that could only be uttered by members of the ruling family, and if any of the Edmonds had uttered it falsely, they would have died from terrible pain. Even Rachel would not have been able to dispute something like that. Still not fully recovered from her surprise, she agreed to consider the issue resolved and only demanded that the main character retake the test. The main characters left the classroom in silence. While Luke behaved as usual, carefree, the protagonist could hardly come to terms with the idea that of all people Noah would be the one to save her. As soon as the young wizard complained that he was hungry, Maleficent immediately suggested that he go to the store for lunch, and was even ready to pay for everything herself. So much did she need to talk to her fiancé face to face. For a moment, Luke decided to fool around by declaring that he was not going to go anywhere, but as soon as Arinda directly said that he would only hinder her, the magician really left. Left alone, the girl said that God was clearly not on her side. She prayed every day for Hensley to die, but he continued to smoke the sky, and the prince calmly noted that this was a very perverted way to express gratitude. Then the man asked the newcomer directly what she needed, and she with exaggerated innocence said that she didn't want to talk about it in advance. Edmund wouldn't like the topic of conversation. However, the boy was not an idiot and clearly understood everything himself, and therefore there was no point in putting on a show any further. Maleficent wanted to officially break off the engagement. The red-eyed brunette asked with a slight smile why he should do this at all. After all, he understood what benefit a marriage union between the future emperor and a member of the great magical order would bring, and he did not want to refuse it. The main character couldn't stand it and shuddered, declaring that this was a line from a real villain, but it was hard to expect anything else from someone like Edmund. And hearing that she had no right to judge someone in this regard, she became even more angry than before. Having caught her breath with some difficulty, the protagonist mockingly suggested that the crown prince make Luke his husband especially, since they had already danced, but Noah pointedly calmly replied that the gray-haired wizard hated him. This was the last straw. Arinda almost hysterically screamed that she herself hated Hensley more than words could express, more than anyone could even imagine. Oddly enough, von Edmund was clearly offended by this because he stared at his interlocutor in genuine surprise and then quietly quoted, "I am happy to enter the academy with you." This was written to him by a real duchess. This really caught the former Earthling off guard because she remembered something like this being present in the book, and the brunette, meanwhile, came very close and quietly added that she had once sincerely liked him. After a moment of silence, the girl reminded him that human feelings were fickle, and Noah, in addition, had never done anything to strengthen this sympathy. Interestingly, the crown prince had no words to object, and the brunette thought vindictively that he must have never even responded to that touching letter. Snorting already tiredly, the false Maleficent finally declared that she would never become Hensley's wife, and certainly did not intend to be a pawn in his relations with the circle of magicians. Moreover, in order to achieve her goal, the time traveler was ready to take the most desperate measures. For example, she would destroy all her relatives herself, and if that was not enough, she would simply finish off Noah despite all the prohibitions and taboos. The man quietly asked if the main character planned to change her mind one day, and she indignantly replied that this would never happen, and that the prince had better make the right decision. The next time readers are shown how Arinda and Serena were quietly talking over lunch. They were discussing the scandal with the test, and the blonde was arguing that Rachel had gone too far. The former Earthling didn't particularly care, since everything ended in her favor, and she was much more interested in the whereabouts of Reynold, who immediately quietly appeared behind her. The young knight looked sweaty and tired but happy as he allowed himself to smile with the corner of his lips, and someone's voice even highlighted this unusual circumstance. It belonged to Oscar, of course. No one noticed when the young wizard joined the feast, but he quickly cast a spell that freshened the air around the red-haired guy. The young swordsman asked in surprise why Luke cared so much about his own sworn rival, and the gray-haired teenager replied that he simply owed Maleficent for bread. Eleanor, meanwhile, continued to insist that Rachel had acted not like a professional teacher, but like a complete goat disgracing Arinda without good reason, but the brunette still did not attach much importance to this. A stunned Serena admitted that her friend's kindness knew no bounds, and the Duchess, taking the blonde's hand tenderly, admitted that she wanted to say the same about her, while Oscar in the background noted wistfully that such coddling happens every day. After finishing purring with her best friend and almost girlfriend, Maleficent turned to Reynold with an extremely determined look. She would very much like to be taught fencing. As it turned out, that short conversation with Noah had changed something in the soul of the traveler. Now she dreamed of mastering both magic and the art of combat, becoming invulnerable. But the meticulous Watson first of all clarified how far she was ready to go in these lessons. As with martial arts, there were vastly different levels and styles of mastery, but Arinda was determined to be strong enough to match the Emperor's. Since the members of the ruling clan were given regular lessons from the best masters, the knight warned that their classes would be very intense, but the protagonist was ready to go along with it. As it quickly turned out, she was determined only in words. When it came to real training, the former dugout again demonstrated a nightmarish weakness and insignificant endurance. She even begged Watson to stop, to cease his studies at least for a while, but he invariably replied that the time had not yet come, and when lights out finally came, the brunette simply collapsed on the floor. Unfortunately for her, it wasn't the end yet. Reynold ordered her to get up and do exercises to relax her body after long sessions, and responded to all objections with a short, "I warned you, no concessions." In desperation, the former dugout accused her friend of heartlessness. After all, she only needed a 10-minute rest, and he refused even such a trifle. Of course it was a game in many ways. Arinda shamelessly pretended to be sick and weak, pressuring him that she had only recently recovered from magical exhaustion in order to skip classes. And it worked even better on the straightforward Watson than one might think. He clearly became nervous, and then even fell to his knees asking for forgiveness for teaching the brunette the same way he was taught, without making allowances for the difference in physique training and level. As Reynolds helped the protagonist up, she thought it was worth it. When else would such a handsome man with a divinely sexy body bow his head to her? But the shock did not end there. The young knight declared that he would carry his ward on his back, and he actually did so, not paying attention to possible objections. Walking through the park, the young man complained that his load was too light and that Arinda needed to eat better and wash herself immediately after arriving, and the brunette only stupidly nodded in agreement because she was in a state of shock from her situation. Not even in her wildest dreams could she have imagined that the man of her dreams would one day carry her on his back like the most precious burden, and in the end she allowed herself to gently hug Reynolds around the neck. A month had passed since that moment. The academy lived its normal life. Noah and Serena did not cross paths, but Maleficent was still worried about what might await her in the future with a changed plot. Of course, Hensley couldn't kill her, but on the other hand, this didn't protect her from any other dangers, and the realization that she could die literally at any second instilled despair in the protagonist. After listening to her complaints, Eleanor wisely stated that it was the transience of life that inspired people to accomplish great things, but if Arinda wanted to completely immerse herself in despondency, well, no one but her could change that. In this way, she tried to cheer up her friend, reminding her that she was a strong and businesslike person, but the young Duchess admitted in her thoughts that she simply wanted to indulge in pleasures in order to die once again without regrets. But now that the plot had taken a sharp turn, she found herself in a very uncertain state, and she was afraid of it, but she decided not to show it and instead once again threw herself into Serena's arms. Then Oscar appeared on the horizon again, and the blonde asked if he had prepared for the history exam, and the brunette noted with displeasure that Luke didn't care about it. He could even be envied. The issue was the difference in their positions in the Tower of Magicians. Although they were both potential members, the gray-haired one was already predicted to be a leader, which allowed him to worry about practically nothing, while Arinda could be kicked out at any moment. The young man mockingly reminded the newcomer that she was his study partner, which meant that no one would dare fire her, but this did not particularly convince the main character. The young sorcerer assured the protagonist that he would not abandon her because he had spent too much effort on finding a partner, and an unimpressed Maleficent asked what his criteria were. Oscar simply replied that he was looking for someone who could make him laugh, and the girl, sighing heavily, simply opened the door to the auditorium. A lot of people had already gathered there. As the former Earthling took her seat at a small table, a short, red-haired girl in glasses named Ginny Clinton approached her and asked if Arinda would like to join her study group. This woman was very interested in how skillfully the protagonist passed the mind-blowing test and answered the questions, so she, as the head of the Fellowship Society, would like to get her into her team. To make her offer more tempting, she casually mentioned that this group also included the guys from Class C, which had many noble offspring. Maleficent's fiancé also received an invitation and is now thinking about it, but alas, Ginny miscalculated with this. As soon as she heard this, Arinda politely, but without alternative, refused. There were several reasons, although the main character of course did not say them out loud. The first was the hated crown prince. The second was Serena, who asked only the time traveler for help with her studies, although she herself studied quite well. And finally, the last, no less important reason. Clinton could look like a modest and quiet gray mouse, but in fact she was an arrogant count's daughter, and she sought to create a flock of the same golden youth. In order not to offend the redhead and not to earn another enemy on her head, Maleficent came up with an explanation that she had already agreed with her friends about common activities, and she could not refuse them. Eleanor, who was sitting next to her, took these words seriously, and with a touching smile she suggested to her best friend that they actually organize such a group. Naturally, the young Duchess couldn't refuse, and a little later the audience is shown two boys walking past the girls openly discussing the possibility that Arinda might have cheated on the test. The protagonist was irritated by how familiarly and loudly they discussed it, but that was all. She even asked Serena not to take this noise seriously. The girl tried to reduce everything to the fact that these were just petty, envious people, and this is the expected fate of the winners. But then Reynolds came onto the stage. He and Maleficent had recently finished training. The young Duchess boastfully asked Watson whether she thought she had made progress since she was not falling off her feet as she had the first time, and when she heard a not entirely decisive yes, she responded with a joke. The young knight seriously asked his charge to watch her sleep schedule, and then completely ignored her suggestion to reduce the load, instead turning to Serena with questions. The main character was not offended by this, but rather amused. It turns out that even this noble and straightforward like a door fencer can avoid uncomfortable topics. Now the protagonist could admit to herself that it was not the advantages of being in the form of Arinda Maleficent, but the living, previously unfamiliar images of Watson, Oscar, and Eleanor that gave her a new meaning to live. The three friends headed to the dining room laughing and discussing what they should have for lunch this time when Serena suddenly fell silent and stared off to the side. The time traveler followed her gaze and almost cursed because William and Noah were sitting together not far from them, as if they themselves had become bosom buddies. It was hard to imagine a worse situation. The two people the heroine hated most were now sitting calmly at the same table, so she decided to simply ignore them so as not to lose her mind. But Watson did not let his student calmly leave the unpleasant topic. He firmly, albeit carefully, took her hand and warned that if these guys were bothering her, it was enough to simply say so. Arinda asked what Reynold would do. In that case, would he beat them up? And cold shivers ran down her spine, because for such a thing in the Empire, the death penalty was imposed without any options. The red-haired young man looked very seriously straight into the protagonist's eyes and calmly confirmed that yes, he would do it without hesitation if that was her wish. Pulling her hand away, Maleficent stepped aside and warned that this was not worth doing. After all, William was her older brother and Von Edmund was her fiancé. Ray repeated the word fiancé in a very strange voice, and the Earthling hastened to explain that she was going to break off the engagement and all ties with the family. It took her a moment to realize how shocked Watson was looking at her. The young knight quickly came to his senses and declared that nothing had happened. His interlocutor simply thought that he had been staring at her for a few seconds with a distorted face and bulging eyes. A little later, the brunette complained about how difficult it was for him to see his little sister, but the protagonist was never deceived. She understood that she was simply serving as an excuse to meet Serena. Without attempting to feign even a shadow of respect, Arinda sighed heavily and admitted that yes, it was very difficult for her to avoid confrontations with these hypocrites, and Will instantly became angry. In her heart, Maleficent was triumphant and gloating. No matter how hard her two-faced brother tried, he had not yet been able to find Eleanor. It was Oscar's merit. At the request of the main character, he used special concealment charms, and now the lustful scoundrel would never see or feel the blonde, even if she was literally under his nose. Having suffered another humiliating defeat, William tried to change the subject to the dissolution of the engagement with the imperial house, but here too the girl made it clear that she did not want to discuss it. Will ignored this and instead continued to nag, arguing about how important this was to their family and how much effort Noah had put into getting back into Arinda's good graces. The latter really struck the girl. She stared in shock at her older relative, and he confirmed that the crown prince was planning to talk to Maleficent again when she cooled down. Before leaving, the young man told the protagonist that she had long since outgrown childhood, so it was time to stop being capricious, and realize that a political marriage did not depend on her alone. The young brunette couldn't understand how it had come to this. In all of her previous lives, Hensley had mercilessly rejected her and even killed her, and now for some reason he desperately wanted to maintain her affection. So desperately that very soon the red-eyed brunette showered the Duchess with luxurious gifts, but this only caused her disgust and even horror. Noah had no idea what kind of things his fiancée liked, so he relied on his own taste and Will's advice, so that Arinda could only mutter that the couple agreed even on their idiotic thoughts. Feeling her face burning with shame and a mountain falling on her shoulders, the protagonist sighed and asked with quiet despair, "Doesn't Noah at least feel sorry for the people who pay him taxes?" The guy calmly retorted that all these luxurious gifts were investments in the future of the empire, and once again reminded them that the ruling family would benefit from their marriage. Poor Maleficent no longer had the strength to joke about it. Trying not to scream out loud, she simply asked him to get out of her sight and throw out all this trash. Von Edmund seemed genuinely confused about how anyone could be angry about ignoring someone for so long. To make up for it, he apologized for that old execution threat. But hey, how was he supposed to know how useful Arinda would be later? The girl finally realized that no one was listening to her, and no one was going to listen. The guy was completely absorbed in himself and his desires, so she ordered Hensley to get out for the last time. The heir to the throne did not allow the protagonist to simply close the door. Grabbing it, the brunette warned that he would not finish yet, and if Maleficent ran away, even more gifts would await her tomorrow. An ordinary girl might have been truly frightened by this, but the main character simply snorted, contemptuously snapped her fingers, and all the gifts to Noah's horror went up in flames. This was one of those rare occasions when the young tyrant completely lost his cool, demonstrating that he could be as afraid as ordinary people. But now, that was not what frightened him. The Duchess's ebony black hair began to rapidly turn white, showing that this spell was draining her life force, not just mana. Seeing this, the girl was quietly horrified. How unstable was her body if even a simple demonstration of an elementary spell caused such damage? But she didn't allow herself to show true emotion in the face of her sworn enemy. She simply told Hensley that he could stay if he wanted to burn alive. It would be even better that way. It is unknown what this would have led to in the end, but a second later, Oscar appeared out of thin air in a purple glow. He was clearly scared, and Maleficent's hair had already turned completely gray. Usually silly and mocking towards everything around him, this time Luke was extremely serious. He instantly extinguished the flames without even wasting a second to cast a spell. And then he began to scold the newcomer strictly like a parent would a disobedient child who had broken the rules, trying to find out whether Arinda was in pain or not. It also quickly became clear that the young sorcerer was angered not only by the thoughtless use of magic. The protagonist, through her stupidity, almost burned down the dormitory, endangering other innocent students. Perhaps Oscar would have lectured the young Duchess for a long time about how she had acted like a complete fool, and that great power requires corresponding responsibility, but the heroine happily fainted. Noah watched all this silently, his face frozen in shock, and the dorm manager, seeing the clouds of smoke and the many walls destroyed by the flames, screamed in horror. Oscar acted like a true knight and responsible teacher. He did not allow the unconscious girl to be under the fire of the teacher's wrath, but instead took the blame upon himself. Much time later, the time traveler with an awkward face tried to explain that there was no need to do such a thing. They were not friends or lovers and became study partners out of interest, so such sacrifices were unnecessary. In fact, the Earthling was increasingly confused by the differences from the original source. In the original, Luke was nothing more than a joker with magical abilities, and she could not imagine him voluntarily accepting punishment for someone else. Out loud, she simply asked him to never do that again. The gray-haired teenager was already helping her all the time. She was starting to feel like a debtor, but the wizard just grinned widely. The future Archmage declared that everything was fine because he planned to take what was due to him anyway, and laughed devilishly, which genuinely frightened the protagonist. Serena, who had been nearby the whole time, sternly yelled at her friends to stop fooling around and finally focus on their studies. But Oscar started whining that he didn't like doing homework during lunch. It also turned out that Reynold had been sitting next to them the whole time, so the young magician didn't miss the chance to mock him, hinting at his lack of intelligence. Watson characteristically completely ignored the obvious jab at him and instead pushed his test towards Maleficent, asking her to look at a question. The protagonist was very surprised, and even laughed nervously. Who would have thought that this straightforward swashbuckler would completely ignore the gray-haired trickster, to his great irritation? Then the former Earthling thought sadly that most likely the guys would soon start showing signs of attention to Serena, and if so, then let the blonde get together with Reynold. They would be happy together. But the brunette, as before, did not allow her true emotions to burst out, and instead skillfully changed the subject, suggesting that Watson ask his questions to Eleanor. Watching the two of them struggle with a mind-boggling puzzle, the girl thought just like a stereotypical fanfic writer and shipper. She demanded that they start looking at each other with interest. She didn't notice that Luke had been staring straight at her the entire time, and was caught off guard when the mage with a predatory smile suggested that they run away together. He reasonably noted that the main character knew the answers perfectly well, and therefore was not obliged to waste time that could be more usefully spent on learning charms. And Luke also realized that for some reason the brunette wanted to bring her friends together. No, he didn't judge, on the contrary. He noted that it was much easier for people to demonstrate true feelings for each other when they were alone, and the protagonist couldn't dispute this argument. After a few seconds of thought, the young Duchess turned an eloquent glance at the wizard, and they both stood in the teleportation circle, only having time to warn Serena and Ray about leaving. They were transported to an auditorium located on the upper floors of the central building of the Academy, and the glow was so strong that it could be seen far beyond the premises. Only then did Maleficent realize what she had done, and she grabbed her head. Eleanor was a gentle angel, of course, but even she could have been offended by such a prank. As for Luke, he now decided to directly ask the question that had been bothering him for a long time. Why was Arinda, who was usually not afraid of anything or anyone, so groveling before the blonde empath? The protagonist honestly admitted that she actually likes Serena, and isn't it natural to treat someone who evokes positive emotions in you with care? Oscar chuckled, thought for a moment, and then kindly asked, "What about Noah?" He also adores Maleficent, and the time traveler angrily asked if she should punch the young sorcerer in the face. Having finished his sarcasm, the magician seriously asked what the Earthling saw in Eleanor, and the brunette simply answered that the blonde was very beautiful and kind. The puzzled young man reminded her that there are a huge number of people in the world who can equally be called beautiful and kind, but Arinda jealously replied that no one can compare with Serena. The teenager noted that this was a mistake, and then moved closer to the protagonist and whispered, "There's another girl like that, and she's right in front of me right now." The main character opened her mouth in shock, unable to say anything intelligible, and Luke, looking at her with an admiring gaze and rosy cheeks, noted that Maleficent was also very beautiful. And when consciousness finally returned to the traveler, she quickly lowered her gaze and muttered that Eleanor was as far away as the moon on foot, but the future Archmage only snorted when he heard that. After a few seconds, his stifled chuckle turned into hysterical laughter, and the protagonist became very angry, deciding that this had been some kind of twisted prank from the very beginning. With difficulty restraining herself, she growled that why don't they get back to studying? It just turned out that the guy wasn't even joking, and he very gently stroked the brunette's head, causing her to freeze in shock and turn pink. Feeling as if her cheeks and ears were being scorched by flames and her heart threatening to fly out of her chest, breaking her ribs, the girl screamed, "What the hell was that?" and that Oscar had ruined her hair. Not paying any attention to this, the gray-haired boy placed his hand on Arinda's shoulder and noted that the mana had stabilized in her body much earlier than even he had expected. He gently patted the protagonist on the head, praising her for having really trained hard, and the aristocrat, sighing, admitted that Reynolds' method had borne fruit. Luke was even more delighted and encouraged her to continue in the same spirit because he, as the future supreme sorcerer, needed capable subordinates, and Maleficent even fell into a stupor from such enthusiasm. Having gathered her thoughts, the former Earthling decided to directly ask her friend the question that had been bothering her since the first days. How did he even know that she could use even high-class spells? As mentioned earlier, the real Arinda was a very poor student. She passed the exams to enter the academy with great difficulty and did not even know how to use elementary charms. True, in order to truly understand this, the time traveler had to meet the executioner's axe twice, and this was a very high price for any knowledge. Looking at his interlocutor without his usual mischief and malice, the young sorcerer explained that the pattern of mana flows in the brunette's body was different from all the other first-year students. For ordinary people, the path and volume of magical power in the body is extremely limited, especially for the young and inexperienced. But the protagonist stood out from the first day like a giant diamond against a background of small, rough gems. And of course there was fun. Oscar wasn't kidding when he said he liked the way Maleficent was sending her fiancé, and the Duchess muttered sadly that in that case the results of his choice were really insignificant. The young man gently stroked the girl's neck and hair, urging her not to say such nonsense. After all, thanks to her, his own life had become much more interesting. For the sake of such fun, the young wizard was ready to do anything, help in any endeavors, and work off academic fines for the rest of his life. And after that, he hugged Arinda. As it turned out, a second later, the boy not only hugged the black-haired aristocrat, but also removed from her neck that very artifact decoration for controlling magic, completely ignoring all objections. The unfortunate protagonist no longer knew what to think. The atmosphere in the room had somehow subtly changed, and now any of Oscar's actions caused strange confusion. Luckily for her, after that, the man himself offered to return to magical training, assuring that this time there would definitely not be such serious problems. And if he was wrong, the gray-haired man swore that from now on he would address Reynold with the highest respect as an older sworn brother. The main character did not miss the opportunity to tease the young sorcerer about the fact that he actually had a soft spot for Watson, but immediately concentrated and prepared for the lessons. Just like the very first time, the former Earthling tried to concentrate all her strength in her chest, and her body began to emit a white-blue supernatural glow. The boy, who was carefully watching her every step, advised her to do the exercise much more slowly, as if the girl were gradually inhaling and then exhaling air. Maleficent dutifully followed this instruction, imagining that she was slowly inflating her lungs, and it clearly helped. The glow became much brighter, filling almost the entire room. But then something went wrong again. The protagonist felt sick. She began to breathe heavily and gustily, and sweat appeared on her face, so Luke fearfully ordered her to immediately stop the exercise. Before the Duchess's hair became whiter than the mountain snow again, a more experienced sorcerer approached her, holding that same protective medallion in his hands, and pronounced a spell in an unknown language. It worked well. The stone seemed to absorb the excess of witchcraft energy, removing the exhaustion and discomfort, and Oscar assured with a smile that Arinda had done very well. And then he most unceremoniously pinched the black-haired aristocrat on the cheek and pulled, exactly as if the newcomer was actually a cute little child. But what happened next made even his eyes widen in shock. The protagonist did not snap back, did not slap him as she could have done earlier, but on the contrary smiled innocently and tenderly. For a few seconds, Luke was completely thrown off balance. He didn't blink and was even afraid to breathe because he had just seen the most beautiful sight of his life. Maleficent didn't notice this because she had closed her eyes. She noted that it was time for them to go back, and this time the gray-haired trickster chose to give a short hoot. While they were holding hands tightly, waiting for the teleportation spell to take effect, the young man kept glancing at his companion, remembering her words about Serena, that it was natural to be out of place around someone you liked. There was a moment of silence for a few seconds, and then Oscar quietly agreed that this was true, and both young men were swallowed up in a supernatural whiteness. After a short time, skip readers are shown Arinda sweating profusely and nervously, apologizing to a pouting Eleanor, admitting that she was a fool and that it won't happen again. The main character went so far that she began to seriously engage in self-flagellation, calling herself a miserable piece of trash unworthy of existence, and this already alarmed Serena. Taking a breath, the blonde explained that she was offended not only by the escape, but also by the fact that she was left alone with Reynold, whom she continued to be a little wary of even after 2 months of communication. And this greatly surprised the brunette. She briefly remembered the affair again, but almost immediately ordered herself to stop thinking about it and promised out loud in the name of Oscar's wrist that she would not abandon her friend like that again. But then the magician himself appeared. At the sight of him, the blonde pouted again, but Luke is not Arinda. He did not roll out a carpet in front of the empath, and he directly said that their magical studies were more important than repeating the already known material. Not having received any support from Maleficent, the gray-haired boy asked her directly why she was silent, and the girl immediately began to make a fool of herself so as not to take anyone's side. The young man wanted to tell him about the protagonist's plan to bring Eleanor together with Reynold, but then the young Duchess forcibly shut him up, pretending to awkwardly hug him, thanking him for the joke. Then she very quietly, so that no one else could overhear, explained that if the blonde found out the truth, it would be a nightmare. She would not talk to Arinda for 3 whole days. Oscar listened to this with a grin, adding that they had in any case achieved solid success in the magical plan, and the curious Serena asked for details. And they turned out to be very pleasant. According to Luke, the magical energy in the body of the traveler was completely stabilized, so the brunette is now able to cast spells without killing herself. Of course, changes and problems could arise, but only if the former Earthling began to push herself to the limit. Plus, she still had the medallion as insurance. The boy had set it up specifically to reduce the risk of accidents happening again to a minimum, and Eleanor was more than happy to help Maleficent put it on. Then the main character asked her friend to tell her how much her mana limit had grown, and specifically asked to say this in front of everyone. The brunette really wanted people to know that in front of them was a young but very strong sorceress and a future member of the all-powerful Tower of Magicians. Luke paused for a moment collecting his thoughts, and everyone in the area held their breath. Not only the main characters but also the random extras in the background pricked up their ears. Arinda really hoped that they would tell her, "You have a whole ocean of mana." But no, instead, the gray-haired student mercilessly admitted that the protagonist's magical powers were comparatively modest, and disappointed whispers from the students were heard in the audience. Averting his steel-gray gaze, the teenager added that even if the newcomer could reach her ceiling, she would not rise above the level of a mage of the imperial family, which was the lowest rank in the organization. True, this was not such a humiliation. A wizard worthy of working with the ruling clan had to have exceptional abilities, and this position seemed petty only by the standards of the tower, where only titans of the world of magic gathered. Oscar quickly began to smile and gently stroke the young duchess's hair, so that she began to suspect that everything that had been said was simply part of some kind of joke. She was about to ask her friend about it directly, but the trickster cut off such an opportunity. He loudly reminded the entire class that the lesson would start any minute, and they needed to start preparing for it. While the other teenagers were focused on their school bags and notebooks, Luke leaned towards Arinda's ear and very quietly, so that only she could hear, said, "Not a wizard of the imperial family, but a wizard of the magic tower." As it turned out, the boy really did lie, and in fact, Maleficent is strong enough to stand out even against the background of the luminaries of witchcraft, and the brunette, of course, became interested in why he lied. No matter how much of a fool the young man seemed, he understood perfectly well what happens to those who are too superior to those around them, and with a grin he said that he did not want to create trouble for his friend. The protagonist tried to remind her that she already had enough problems, so one more wouldn't make a difference, but the teenager was adamant on this issue. No extra troubles, he couldn't stand them. He ended his speech with the phrase, "therefore." But there was no continuation, so the young aristocrat sullenly wondered what the point of all this was. Then Eleanor behaved strangely. She gasped, stared at a certain point, and said, "Strange," which immediately alerted the former Earthling. And Oscar, continuing to look at the girls with an unusually serious and focused face, finally finished his speech with the words, "It's not that important, Arinda." Practice has shown that the future Archmage was completely right when he decided not to reveal the full potential of the main character's power to those around him. Rumors about her still spread very quickly, giving rise to a stream of clingy petitioners. When yet another such freebie seeker didn't hesitate to show up right during the lunch break, the main characters sighed heavily, and then Luke, with a flick of his finger, created an impenetrable barrier for those around him. Now that the meal could be finished in relative peace, Maleficent smiled sweetly at her young mentor and asked what he thought about all this. Having complained about ordinary people with their simple lives, the gray-haired teenager admitted that he would have known about this in advance. He lied that Arinda's potential was no higher than that of ordinary graduates. From conversations with the other guys, it became known that this was indeed far from the first case of annoying attention from a stranger. These days, the protagonist could not really study or even just spend time with friends. Serena, in particular, was even offended by this because she felt as if her best friend had been stolen, and the brunette mentally squealed with affection, admitting that only this blonde bun was allowed to be jealous and possessive towards her. She took Watson's statement absolutely seriously. The young knight usually ignored things that did not concern him, and even if he complained about some pestering, it meant that the situation had crossed all boundaries. Oscar rested his head lazily on his hand and repeated that his mistakes in judgment had caused Maleficent a lot of trouble, and Reynold repeated his words very slowly. No, he wasn't seething with rage towards his opponent, as could have been resolved, but he simply sincerely didn't understand the essence of the problem, and they explained to him that what Luke said was tantamount to a lie that Arinda fenced at the level of imperial knights. The red-haired youth opened his mouth in surprise, muttered under his breath, "That's what it is," and then looked at the protagonist with sincere admiration and admitted that she was an even greater person than she had seemed before. Distracted for a few seconds to quarrel with Oscar once again, Watson again turned to the brunette with an offer to become not only a great sorceress, but also a fencer. This scared the former dugout half to death. She immediately understood that if she agreed, the guy would drive her wild and tried to flatly refuse. It might have worked with anyone else, but not with this redhead. Reynold was a stupid and incredibly stubborn man who cared about nothing but swordsmanship, and once he made a decision, he would go on with it until he put it into practice. Naturally, he forced the unfortunate Duchess to train in an intensive regimen, and no matter how much she cried, no matter how hard she begged for mercy, no one gave her a break. Rushing around the stadium with sandbags tied to her legs, the brunette desperately tried to understand what this was all for, especially since in the book Watson never mocked Eleanor like that. He simply promised to become her protector. Thinking about this, the girl also wondered why Reynold continued to scare the blonde even after so much time, and regretted that she was not able to read the emotions of those around her to find out the knight's own feelings on this matter. Then the main character remembered that in the novel Serena learned to truly read those around her only a few years later, which means that now she only sees a very general picture of their souls. Even in the middle of a marathon run, the protagonist managed to forget about reality and immerse herself in her own thoughts, and therefore only thanks to Watson's hands did she not crash into a gun stand. After that, the red-haired fencer suggested taking a little break, and the brunette, unable to contain herself, laughed. And to his puzzled question, she answered, "You are still a human being, too." It was just that while running, Reynold looked like some kind of tireless robot, but now it was not difficult to notice. He was also very tired and sweaty, just like Orinda herself. Hearing this, the red-haired boy awkwardly rubbed his neck, searching for the right words to respond, while Maleficent began to rummage through her pockets in search of the handkerchief Serena had given him. Finding him, she gently and carefully wiped the sweat from the young man's cheek, and Ray, blushing a little with embarrassment, said that he could handle it just fine, and wiped it all away with his sleeve himself. The young noblewoman reminded him that Watson had removed the sandbags from her feet a little earlier, which meant that he had also tried to help, but the swordsman quickly changed the subject to the scarf. It was recently given to the main character by Eleanor because she couldn't accompany her friend to training due to exam preparation, and this simple gesture on her part almost made Orinda cry once again. However, the brunette had not forgotten about her old plan to bring her two friends together, and even now she was telling Reynold how sweet and good-natured the blonde was. While the protagonist was praising her friend in every possible way, she did not notice at all that Watson was not interested in this. He was looking only at her and trying to listen to what concerned Maleficent, and not Eleanor. When it came to that unsuccessful stunt with teleportation, the red-haired swordsman looked away and calmly admitted that yes, leaving him alone with the blonde had been a mistake. Here, the newcomer realized that she had blurted out something unnecessary and tried to return the topic to the merits of the empath, but the fencer, already a little tired, interrupted her, like, "Yes, Serena is a wonderful person, but never do that again." The Duchess felt something inside her twitch unpleasantly, and goosebumps ran down her spine. For some reason, Reynold refused to listen to this stream of praise and turned the conversation to her. The time traveler, however, calmed down when Watson agreed that yes, the blonde was the type of person that everyone liked, considering this a sign of her victory. The young knight noted that a good man attracts other good men, and judging by his very eloquent look, he was not talking about Eleanor at all. And so it turned out. The young man directly told the protagonist that she was good, and this simple in essence phrase made the black-haired girl freeze as if struck by thunder. But that wasn't the end of it. Ray demonstrated that he wasn't the complete fool that many people thought he was by asking Orinda to stop trying to matchmake him with their mutual friend. The shock of the former earthling was so strong that she didn't even scream in her thoughts. She just quietly muttered, "Good," after which the green-eyed swordsman smiled. As the main characters returned to the dorm under the light of the setting sun, the time traveler frantically tried to understand who exactly Watson had feelings for if it wasn't Eleanor. And in the end, it became clear that there was only one candidate. Of course, it could only be Maleficent herself, and the realization of this made the protagonist feel as if her body had been struck by invisible lightning. In her very first life back on Earth, the main character had read a bunch of short stories about women who ended up in the bodies of minor characters who made all the important men fall in love with them. But she was scared to think that the same thing could happen to her. In addition, the brunette never forgot that the true owner of her body was a villain, and she also felt like a thief who stole from Serena what should have rightfully gone to her. All these thoughts carried Orinda away so much that she once again stopped noticing the reality around her. It took a light poke from Reynolds to bring her to her senses. The main character awkwardly lied that everything was fine, but Watson, with his characteristic directness, advised her not to think so deeply when Maleficent was alone, otherwise she would hit her head on something. Then the Duchess asked what they were having for dinner, and the knight shared that Eleanor had told him about the student steak hamburger, and after that the brunette wondered what else her supposedly stupid friend might know. As if reading her thoughts, the swordsman confirmed that he knew what question he would be asked, and this only made the protagonist's suspicions grow because it didn't fit at all with the canonical Watson. The former Earthling found herself in a very delicate situation. She was not exactly sure that Reynolds loved her, and she was afraid to ask directly. What if the answer was positive? For herself, Orinda decided that no matter what the outcome, she would in any case try not to hurt Eleanor and respect her feelings. As long as it didn't concern Noah, he shouldn't get together with the blonde at all. And at that very moment, as if on purpose, everyone's favorite crown prince appeared out of nowhere. He crept up on the bride from behind and scared her so much that the latter almost jumped out of her pants. Hensley calmly asked the noblewoman if she was going to dinner, and the woman thought with despair, what if His Highness is an inveterate masochist and thirsts for hatred since he does not want to back down even after direct admissions of hostility? Her nerves were already at their limit, and she was about to send Edmund to distant erotic things once again, but she didn't have time. A red-haired young man stood between them and coldly asked what the brunette wanted. The heir to the throne responded to this with very dry sarcasm. Last time he said the defender was Luke Oscar, and now a new candidate has appeared. The protagonist thought with slight fear that she personally might be untouchable for the eldest prince, but the same could not be said about Watson. He was risking his neck. It was precisely to protect her best friend that the young Duchess stepped forward and gently but firmly asked the knight to stand aside. It was her personal business, nothing more. As in previous times, the conversation between the two main characters very quickly turned into an exchange of barbs and insults. Noah reproached Arienda for her disrespectful manner of speech, and she reproached him for stalking and persistence. Hearing, "I told you not to catch my eye," the young man once again reminded Maleficent that she has a fiancé, and it is himself, of course. And he not so subtly hinted to the protagonist that she shouldn't hang around with other guys, to which the brunette retorted that Hensley, as the heir to the crown, should take care of his life. He only has one. After this, Edmund admitted that he wanted to talk to the newcomer for the sake of one honest answer, and even his face changed, becoming from cold and condescending to pleading. Orinda had never seen such an expression on the future ruler of the empire before, and it puzzled and alarmed her so much that the woman forgot about her hatred for a moment. Noah reminded him that in his last letter, Maleficent had said how much she liked him, and the girl had noticed how hard and furiously the usually cold-blooded Reynolds clenched his fists. Meanwhile, the prince wanted to know when and why he was hated, and the Earthling thought for a while about how best to explain her problem with reincarnations to those around her before snapping, "I just hate you, nothing more to add." After that, she turned away and resolutely walked away, asking the surprised Watson to follow her. But Hensley threw back at her that in that case he would wait. It's not just about politics, he's genuinely curious, but the prince didn't have time to finish his sentence. The protagonist, completely furious, ordered him to shut his mouth. She'd seen this scene in novels hundreds of times, two enemies gradually becoming closer and making peace, and she didn't want to go through it with the man who'd killed her twice. But Noah still finished his sentence by saying, "I'm curious about you." In Asian works, and not only in them, a plot device was widespread. The main character, having died at the hands of her beloved man, is reborn in an old body, sees how her offender has changed, and sincerely forgives him and even falls in love again. But in reality, this is only possible if there are at least some shoots left from past feelings, and nothing like that has ever happened between the main characters of this work. Noah killed Arinda twice, sending her to the chopping block, and the second time happened absolutely undeservedly and without reason. And you still want the girl to be the first to put an end to the feud, to forgive her former tormentor? No, because Heal Me Lady is no longer a book for the protagonist, but real life. And reality is not at all the same as a silly romantic novel. No matter how attractive and rich Hensley was after what he had gone through, he only caused Maleficent disgust, fear, and hatred. She did not even want to be near him, let alone resume the relationship. After all, this man was a real sociopath. He even openly threatened to kill the time traveler in this life, and probably would have done so if Luke had not provided her with protection. Yes, he didn't remember the previous timelines, and technically he really didn't do anything serious to this last Arinda, but that didn't change the fact that at heart, Edmund remained a ruthless killer. Overwhelmed with emotion, the brunette herself did not notice at what point she began to whisper insults, but Noah clearly heard them because he stared at the bride with an even more stunned look. In the end, the young aristocrat managed to pull herself together and even calmly asked if Hensley had gone crazy, but the young man only asked why she decided so. The brunette continued to think that the reason for their discord was that old threat to execute Maleficent, but he believed that he was within his rights. After all, it was the woman who first threw him a humiliating insult that the prince could not and should not endure. In addition, as already mentioned, no one except the protagonist had any idea about the existence of the previous timelines, so from Hensley's point of view, his fiancée, with whom he had a normal relationship at some point, simply began to hate him, terribly, humiliate and insult him, and for no reason. Looking at Arinda with a bit of regret, the Crown Prince tried to find out what was the reason for this feud: refusal to break off the engagement or ignoring it. The problem was that the Emperor's son looked at these things very differently than a modern girl from Earth. He really didn't think that using his wife as a useful bargaining chip was something bad. Against her will, the main character thought that Noah was right in his own way. He acted in accordance with his morals, and she was the first to start the feud. So now the time traveler even bit her lip, trying to understand whether she should ask for forgiveness and make peace. But then the boy opened his red eyes in horror, as if the most terrible and disgusting nightmare had appeared right in front of his face, and shouted, "Arinda Maleficent, you again!" The protagonist didn't know it yet, but in fact her hair began to rapidly fade again. Just like when she used spells, only now she definitely wasn't trying to cast a spell. The former dugout felt like a person on the verge of fainting. She was overcome by intense heat and sweat. Her chest became tight and the air was rapidly leaving her lungs, leaving a feeling of suffocation. That's how badly Noah's close and long presence affected her. Her consciousness and subconscious screamed in unison, begging her to run away, and even Luke, sensing something was wrong, dropped everything and teleported to his friend. The gray-haired wizard gently took the main character by the hand and carried her to a completely different place, where with the utmost care he sat her down on a bench, asking along the way if she had eaten anything. Without waiting for an answer, Oscar asked the brunette to wait a little, and again disappeared in a magical glow. After him there remained only sparks reminiscent of fireflies. The teenager returned just seconds later, handing Maleficent a bag of food. And when she asked how Luke knew her location in the first place, the mage explained that the mana in Arinda's body had a unique pattern. The young trickster's talent was so impressive that he felt the energy of witchcraft throughout the vast territory of the academy, and even a little beyond its borders. Realizing this, the protagonist asked with slight excitement whether the sorcerer knew about her situation. As it turned out, no. The boy had no idea that the girl had met Hensley once again, and was experiencing extreme stress because of it. He simply felt her desperate, incomparable desire to run away. Then he opened the bag of pies he had brought and almost forcefully shoved one of them into the girl's mouth. She needed to restore her body's strength and energy and not chatter away. While the brunette obediently chewed, he nevertheless deigned to answer the unspoken question. Sorcerers lose control over their powers if their stress goes beyond all limits, and does Arinda herself know what state she was in 5 minutes ago? In any case, she had to be very careful, because even the protective medallion did not provide absolute protection from such troubles, but Maleficent only asked if Oscar would like to know the details of the incident. In response, the young wizard looked eloquently at his interlocutor and calmly asked, even if he asked, would the protagonist share something like that? Stuttering and feeling those same goosebumps running through her body again, the Duchess asked if Luke knew that she hated the Crown Prince, and in doing so she almost accidentally called him Noah. He knew, and of course almost immediately guessed that everything that had happened was connected with Hensley, and the woman began to think about how best to explain that she was in fact a traveler from another world, that she had already died twice because of Edmund, and was afraid of him because of this. Seeing and feeling the terrible confusion his girlfriend was in, Oscar calmly asked her not to rush. He did not need an immediate answer here and now. In the end, the brunette awkwardly explained that there was a reason why she despised and hated her fiancé, but the aristocrat could not name it due to certain circumstances, and the event that caused the rift between them had not yet happened, as wild as it may sound. The prince himself adds fuel to the fire. He pursues her claims that he has changed, demands explanations, but the former earthling cannot give them, and Noah's very presence is incredibly disgusting to her. When Luke quietly asked and, the protagonist admitted that she herself was no longer sure whether she was doing the right thing at all, continuing to treat with anger someone who perhaps did not deserve it. Maleficent honestly didn't know if she should stop hating a guy who hadn't done anything to her yet, and Oscar clarified that if other people knew the reason for the feud, would they agree that Hensley was the last scumbag? Arinda agreed that yes, and then the young sorcerer asked another more concise and simple question. If everything is like this, then why does the woman doubt it all? She made it clear from the very beginning that her ex-fiancé only evoked negative emotions in her, but the brunette continued to pester her. So why does the protagonist feel guilty in front of him? The main character thought about it and realized that her friend was completely right. Edmund was rotten to the core in his past life. He killed her not even for bullying Serena, but simply because he was bored with her. Luke smiled encouragingly at the girl and advised her to just do what she wanted. Even if the Duchess broke some rules, he would continue to support her. The time traveler looked at her interlocutor with a look full of fear and confusion. She clearly wanted to, but at the same time some internal prohibitions were getting in the way. Oscar might have seemed like an empty-headed buffoon, but he was actually a man wise beyond his years, and so he wisely advised choosing one position, since tossing from side to side would only cause more suffering. The former earthling stared desperately at the ceiling and thought about what her heart really wanted, what she would really like for herself. After some thought, Arinda decided that she would no longer pretend, and even if those around her saw her as a complete scoundrel and selfish person, then that was their problem. The inspired Maleficent didn't even have time to thank the young sorcerer when he already more angrily gave her another instruction. Let her just ignore unpleasant people. There was no point in talking to them, only extra stress. Having thought about it, the newcomer realized that Luke was completely right in this regard as well. After all, she listened attentively to Hensley every time he approached, but why, for what purpose? Seeing that his words had hit the right spot, the young wizard smiled happily and gently patted the protagonist on the head, thereby showing that he was proud of her. The main character smiled back a little awkwardly, but still sincerely happy for the help and support, and at the same time she realized that it was not Oscar who needed her help. On the contrary, it was the gray-haired, crazy but wise wizard who became her support, and she sincerely thanked her friend for this, but did not miss the opportunity to tease him once again, mentioning Serena. Luke grumbled, pretended to be angry, but that was all. After that, the young people smiled tenderly at each other again, and then slowly and touchingly took each other's hands. Still holding each other's palms, Maleficent and Oscar stood up, looking into each other's eyes, not like classmates or a mentor and student, but like equals, best friends. The action moved a little into the future to the Academy's cafeteria, where the wizard and the empath watched with noticeable tension as Arianda and Reynold looked at each other. The brunette herself felt terribly awkward. Yesterday, she wanted to run away from Hensley so much that she completely forgot about her promise not to abandon Watson like that suddenly. And now that she had run away twice, leaving the young swordsman alone, she simply didn't know what to say as an apology, how to look into his eyes. It was excruciatingly difficult to speak, but continuing to just sit and remain silent was much worse, so the protagonist eventually overcame herself and directly asked the red-haired young man if he was very angry. She herself was sure that Ray was literally seething with indignation. How else to explain the fact that he looked intently at her but said nothing and did not even eat? However, the young knight's answer genuinely puzzled Maleficent, causing her mouth to drop open in shock. In fact, he was not angry at all, as it might seem from the outside. Having regained control over her jaws and tongue, Arinda asked, why then had Watson been drilling her with his green eyes for so long, as if he wanted to burn a hole? The boy rubbed his face awkwardly, searching for the best words to explain, but eventually realized that he couldn't do it and simply apologized for causing discomfort. Looking down and trying not to notice the presence of Luke and Serena nearby, Reynolds quietly admitted that all this time he was angry not at the Duchess, but at himself. He was present at that quarrel, which means he should have acted like a real man, take the protagonist away, and preferably also give Hensley a punch in the nose. But Arinda sternly reminded him that we were talking about the Emperor's eldest son. An attempt to attack such an important person would have resulted in the execution of anyone who was not a sorcerer of the tower, and the young warrior could not help but understand this, especially since he himself was a commoner. On the other hand, he could simply not know who Edmund was. Watson, at their first meeting, did not even understand that the main character came from the Maleficent family, although the entire empire knew that golden eyes and black hair were almost exclusively theirs. The young knight thought for a moment, rolling the newborn thought around on his tongue for a while, before calmly agreeing, well, yes, that fop had red eyes. The protagonist almost fell out of her chair when she realized that Reynolds really didn't recognize Hensley as a prince, and in horror she ordered the guy to never conflict with the brunette again. It would cost him too much. But the fencer himself was not yet impressed by the excitement. Looking at his friend with the same calm and impenetrable face, he simply promised that next time he would be more careful. The main character clearly noticed the peculiarity of this formulation and almost lost consciousness when she realized that, contrary to all the laws of self-preservation, Watson raised his hand against one of the most important people in the Empire. Only now the teenager became a little embarrassed and tried to calm the main character, assuring her that Hensley had not hit her that hard and had not caused any serious damage. While the former Earthling was mentally screaming in horror, Oscar was laughing and praising Reynolds for doing something useful after all, and Serena was staring at them with wide eyes. Unable to bear it, the time traveler raised her head and in a very stern, cold voice ordered Luke to shut up, and it was as if all the lights in the room went out. It became so gloomy. Having shut up the gray-haired joker, the brunette turned back to the fencer with a desperate face and asked if he even understood what he had done, who he had hit. Watson made it clear that he understood but didn't care, so even Eleanor couldn't resist gently reminding him that the Duchess was simply afraid of the consequences for her friends. Maleficent fervently confirmed that everything was so, but Noah was also a vindictive, vengeful dog with a disgusting character from which nothing good could come in principle. The protagonist was again stuck like a jammed gramophone. She kept telling Serena for a long time what a scoundrel Hensley was, until the blonde pinched her cheek again and reminded her that we were talking about something else. Having come to her senses, the former Earthling now looked seriously at Reynolds and reminded him that he was a future knight. He could not use violence thoughtlessly, and an attack on the ruler's eldest offspring would in any case cause a lot of serious problems. Hearing this, Luke asked with a mocking smile what was wrong. He liked it, and he was always ready to erase Noah's memory so that Watson could continue to beat him. The time traveler made a tired face splay, and the young wizard wisely hastened to shut up, while the red-haired swordsman agreed that yes, mindless violence was bad in any case. But at the same time, the man was confused by one thing. It seemed to him that the words of his interlocutor conveyed the meaning that Edmund cannot be touched just because he is the ruler's son. But Reynolds couldn't care less about it. Even if he had known from the start who Hensley was, he would have knocked out all his teeth for insulting and threatening Arinda, and he would definitely knock them out in the future if the brunette didn't calm down no matter what the price. Watson genuinely didn't care how much power this guy had, whose son he was, or how many thugs were ready to stand up for him. He did something unforgivable by offending the protagonist. Someone else would have been taken aback or simply delighted by this, but Maleficent knew full well how dangerous such behavior was and was now trying to think of what to say and do so that her friends would not be at risk. After a few seconds of intense brainwork, the young aristocrat finally slowly thanked her friend for his help, but she wanted to warn him about something. She had to crush Edmund herself without any help from anyone. And at the same time, for the first time in a long time, she looked Watson straight in the eye with determination. Readers were not shown the reactions of the other characters. Instead, the action immediately moved forward. The main characters were sitting in the library under a protective barrier to keep strangers out and doing their homework. The guys, meanwhile, were fooling around. Oscar was fooling around, Watson was looking at the brunette like a lovesick calf, and even the impenetrable Eleanor was eventually angered by this. The Duchess and the swordsman instantly stared at their textbooks, but Luke, on the contrary, only began to whistle some song even louder. He didn't give a damn about Serena's indignation. The blonde stared fiercely at the young wizard, as if she was trying to burn a hole in him, but to the gray-haired sorcerer, even this was like a drop in the bucket. Unable to withstand the terrible pressure from the usually gentle girl, Orinda decided to put Oscar in his place herself, angrily ordering him to immediately stop twiddling his thumbs. But even this had no effect on the teenager. Lazily staring at the ceiling, he replied that he did not need training, and the aristocrat, now confused, said that he needed to do something useful. Without turning his head, the young man with silver hair and eyes asked, "Who, in Maleficent's opinion, put up the protective barrier that prevented the crowd of freeloaders from bombarding her with demands?" But the brunette replied with a grin that it was a trifle. After all, she herself could have put up protection from applicants and no worse than the lazy tricksters. This really got to the guy. He immediately tensed up, looked at his interlocutor, and added that such shields were only available to sorcerers who had been trained in the tower. Then the protagonist demanded that she be shown the spell formula. Oscar had promised to teach something that was only available to his brothers in the order, so let him do it. Orinda promised that she would only look for 10 seconds, and the more experienced wizard, believing that the heroine would not have time to understand anything anyway, drew supernatural symbols in an unknown language in the air. Exactly 10 seconds later, and not a moment earlier or later, the guy hid the magic drawings, causing the girl to feel a dull irritation. But that was a small thing. She understood the most important thing. Then the aristocrat turned to her friend and menacingly asked whether he would study if he had no more classes, and Oscar immediately tensed up, feeling a bad smell. What happened next made all the main characters wide-eyed and open-mouthed, because a second, much larger force field appeared on top of the first. After all, the protagonist had a photographic memory. She never forgot anything, and in her very first life she easily memorized entire books. Luke was genuinely shocked, but Orinda naturally was not going to reveal one of her main secrets, and simply arrogantly replied that this was the result of her amazing talents and Oscar should fulfill his promise and cram textbooks. The silver-haired teenager turned to Maleficent and said very seriously that now was not the time for studying. He had never seen such a gift, even among the members of the tower. But the former dugout still wasn't going to reveal her trump cards, so she repeated the order, and the poor guy had no choice but to fulfill his promise. And the newcomer, unable to resist, decided to make fun of him even more. She started running behind his back, staring at the textbook and pestering him with nagging and instructions. The young man probably wanted to tell her off with such an attitude, but the brunette, with the sweetest smile possible, added that all the small talk would only take place after classes. She then began to coo at Serena in a disgusting manner, further infuriating Oscar and not even allowing him to speak out, but eventually she moved on to Reynold. The protagonist remembered all the educational material perfectly well thanks to her previous incarnations, and now for the first time she seriously thought about helping her friends by revealing what awaited them next. Watson had already failed his exams several times. Orinda announced to the group that she would write a notebook for them all with possible exam questions, where important topics would be highlighted, and Oscar would help them get through it quickly, making sure that their hands did not hurt from writing for a long time. But the young sorcerer didn't like it at all that he was being used like some kind of tool, and in addition he reminded him that Maleficent had recently almost fainted from problems with mana, so she had no business playing around. With these words, the young man not only dispelled the impenetrable barrier, as if it were some kind of inflated soap bubble, but also took away the book with which the brunette was working. It was time for Luke to get his revenge, so with carefully concealed pleasure he called the book his hostage, and brushed aside any possible objections with a simple reminder of the after-school chat rule. Later they were shown walking down an open corridor. The time traveler was boring into the magician's back with an irritated look and asking if he remembered that classes were about to start, but Oscar made it clear that he didn't care. The boy asked the Duchess directly what was more important to her, her studies or him, and the girl was taken aback by such an obvious question. She really didn't want to run around the stadium like a duck again. Then the future Archmage suggested simply erasing the memories of everyone who might express dissatisfaction, but the protagonist asked if he had gone crazy with such criminal ideas. But after this, the main character seriously thought, where is the guarantee that she herself has not had her brain cleared several times Luke's abilities and skills more than allowed her to do something like this? Meanwhile, the wizard himself realized something else. It dawned on him that Maleficent had the ability to completely remember things in a very short time, and he asked about it directly. Moreover, he was interested not only in confirming his guess, but also in how long the newcomer had possessed this gift in general. And judging by the expression on his face, the topic was extremely serious and important. The main character reasonably asked why she should be held accountable for her intelligence, and the magician admitted that she was right in some ways, but continued to insist on his own. Returning the book to its owner, he reproached Orinda for never having told anyone about her gift before, and the girl again reasonably asked why she was obliged to do so. Luke was about to say what he would do then, but after the first words he fell silent with a depressed look. For some reason, this topic filled the usually restless trickster with melancholy. After a few seconds of silence, he said in a strange voice, "It's even more fun this way," and Maleficent recoiled, unable to believe what she had just heard. Oscar continued to insist that they were study partners and had to trust each other, tell each other all the important things, and Arianda could not accept the fact that they continued to see her as some kind of clown. These were no longer the usual friendly skirmishes. The protagonist seriously shouted at Luke that she was not born to make him laugh. The discouraged young man wanted to explain, but the newcomer was too angry to continue communicating with him, and so he quickly took his leave, citing lessons. But the teenager had other plans. He grabbed the former dugout by the hand, and she irritably threw over her shoulder that she didn't have time to chat. Any more excuses could be heard during recess. The girl didn't have time to finish the sentence completely because they were surrounded by a magical blue glow, like when a portal was activated, and Oscar allowed his interlocutor to jump. They both teleported near the right classroom, but didn't jump into it. Luke had learned his lesson from last time, and the lesson was again being taught by Rachel, who loved to punish students. Serena had already taken her usual place next to Arianda and had prepared all the school supplies, but the other characters didn't pay much attention to this. The wounds from the quarrel were still too fresh. Literally feeling with her skin that something had gone wrong, Eleanor wrote on her notebook, "Did you have a fight?" And Maleficent quickly scribbled down a reply, "No, I'm the only one who was offended." The blonde noted that Oscar actually looked depressed as well, perhaps because of how easily the protagonist had reversed his spell, and the heroine even admitted that this might be true. After thinking hard about what to say to her friends so as not to further antagonize them, the empath eventually added another caption, "Maybe he's upset that you didn't tell him?" While Rachel read the material from the textbook and wrote it down on the board, the friends continued to quietly text each other, and at some point Serena rightly noted that suddenly poking someone in the nose is not the same as saying it directly. In her defense, the Duchess wrote that Oscar continued to see her as a joke, and Eleanor, after a moment's hesitation, wrote with a tender smile, "We love you much more than you think." For all his knowledge and some wisdom, Luke was still a child at heart, and it was very difficult for him to show his true feelings, and Orinda, not wanting to give in, thought that he still did not excuse him. Her aura of resentment and bitterness became almost tangible, so much so that the empath who reads the emotions of those around her widened her eyes in fear and excitement and began to sweat. Before the tide of negativity turned into a real ocean, the blonde very quickly wrote that there was no need to be offended anyway, and the wizard, yes, made a mistake, of course. Here, Maleficent got a crumpled piece of paper. It contained a message from Oscar himself, inviting the heroine to classes on studying the magic of the tower, and to the remark that he had not had time for this before the guy calmly wrote that he did not consider the protagonist ready for this. The action shifts to the main character's lunchtime. The fencing lessons have already taken place, and Serena even noted that the newcomer is now much more cheerful after them, especially in comparison with herself at the beginning. The young aristocrat was genuinely pleased by this. She herself noticed that now her body begins to ache if she does not do physical exercise for a long time, and not the other way around. Reynold, who was present, wanted to say something about the intensity of the training, and Orinda took her words back in horror. She guessed what he was getting at, and did not want to feel like a victim of torture again. The red-haired young man looked at the Duchess with a slight smile indicated only by his lips, and the girl, feeling how quickly her heart was beating, interpreted it as unspoken support. But Luke wouldn't be himself if he kept quiet. Looking at Watson with slight contempt, he said that there would be no intensive training with the sword, because now Maleficent was diving headlong into magic. The young knight responded indifferently, "I understand," and continued eating as if nothing had happened, so the young sorcerer could not resist and asked directly, was he really just going to ignore everything? The man calmly explained that it didn't matter what the protagonist would focus on, blade training or spells. It would be part of her training anyway. Therefore, Reynold didn't care whether Orinda would be more of a sorceress or a warrior. The main thing was that she would become better. And after that, Watson smiled warmly at the former Earthling. The girl noted that the knight was really going to charm her, feeling her face burning with fire, and Serena meanwhile clarified whether she really wanted to go to charms classes again after physical training. The young aristocrat assured her friend that everything would be fine, that they would have time to do their homework together, and she preferred not to mention that studying in her previous life had been much more difficult. She reassured Eleanor once again that she was enjoying their time together, and the empath, smiling broadly, admitted that she shared those emotions. She also politely but firmly pushed away the plate of salad that Maleficent had been furtively tossing all this time, repeating that she was not going to accept someone else's food. Hearing that the girls were going to retire to Serena's room to study their books and do their homework together, Oscar excitedly asked if he could join them. Orinda asked irritably if Luke wanted to move into the girls' wing of the dorm, and the guy explained that he simply couldn't accept the idea of such a promising student studying on her own, not to mention the time Noah stalked her room. Another skirmish broke out between them, into which Watson was also dragged, and although the fencer tried to assure her that he did not need it, the blonde reasonably reminded him that Reynold risked failing his exams. Here the young magician took the floor again. He assured that he did not think that there were no alternatives, but he had such a fiery, mocking look that the protagonist immediately remembered the ball at which her friend danced with Hensley in a dress. Feeling like clouds were gathering overhead, Orinda admitted with a stony face that she was feeling a little uneasy, and Serena confirmed that she felt the same. After this, a short time skip occurs. It is shown how the girls now in their night pajamas look in surprise at something ahead, and Maleficent is also trying to understand how Watson agreed to this. Their shock was easy to understand because the young trickster had disguised himself and Reynold as young women, so carefully that their own mothers would not have recognized them as men. The real girls felt a monstrous mixture of awkwardness and despair, as if they were victims of an overly drawn-out farce, and Oscar, not wanting to calm down, even offered them to touch his new breasts in order to make sure they were real. Deciding that Luke had finally lost his mind, the brunette and blonde slammed the door without further ado, with such force that the sound must have been heard throughout the entire dorm. The sorcerer, deeply offended, pounded on the gates, demanding that they be opened, and when Orinda asked Eleanor if it was worth doing, the dead-faced empath admitted that their efforts were admirable. After some thought, Maleficent opened the door, but demanded that the guys immediately return to their true form if there was no one outside. The main character would die of shame if such transgenders crossed her threshold. Luke narrowed his eyes in displeasure and clarified that she didn't like it. It was a surprise, but he still cast the spell, making himself and Reynold men again. The former dugout instantly dragged them into the room and slammed the doors again with a disgusting feeling that if anyone found out about this, they would all be corpses. Sincerely embarrassed, the guys asked if everything was really that bad. After all, they wanted to amuse their friends a little. And when Eleanor, still not having recovered from the shock, reminded them that they had gathered for study, the wizard frivolously reminded them that there was a time for work and a time for fun. As expected, the lessons were a failure. Oscar very quickly began to whine that he hadn't turned into a woman for this, causing Arinda to grind her teeth in irritation and suggest that she leave. The gray-haired teenager asked in horror how his partner could be so heartless, and Maleficent retorted that she had picked him up off the street, imagining the guy as a stray kitten. In an attempt to find support and justice, the young sorcerer asked Reynold whether he thought the protagonist was being overly categorical, but the redhead chose to remain silent. As it turned out a few seconds later, it wasn't that Watson had decided to distance himself from Luke's jokes once again. He had simply fallen asleep and even collapsed face down on the table. The main characters began to decide what to do. Serena asked to transfer the knight to her bed, and to the offer to simply teleport him to the men's room, she reasonably noted that he would be scared waking up in the wrong environment. The wizard began to mutter under his breath that the swordsman would be much more perplexed by waking up in someone else's bed, but he still obeyed and helped drag the red-haired guy. The previously silent protagonist noted that at such a time, Reynold usually sleeps, so his body simply obeyed the regime, and Oscar sarcastically noted that at such a time, he continues to act up. He then asked his friends if they planned to take a break after they finished their homework, and Serena agreed hesitantly, so Arinda patted her on the back, gently praising her for her kindness. Luke was incredibly delighted and vowed to immediately put an end to that is, his studies. He even demanded that women ask him questions so that he could explain the material. Maleficent almost couldn't believe her ears. The magician who boasted about how he hated fuss and worries was taking on her responsibilities, but the young man only nodded as if to say, "Yes, go and rest already." Still confused, the main character sat down on the bed next to Watson and admired his sleeping but handsome face. She even thought that he would make a wonderful analog of Sleeping Beauty. Unable to resist, she decided to have a little fun. With the utmost care, she took Reynolds' upper limbs and moved them so that they were crossed over his chest, as is usually depicted on that very fairy tale princess. The swordsman had never let her get so close before, but now, when she could admire him as much as she wanted, and notice those details that the author of the book had not invented, the traveler felt as if she herself had fallen into a dream. Unable to resist the temptation, the brunette again reached for the strong, muscular palms of the young fencer, only for him to suddenly grab her. Naturally, the protagonist was scared and worried. Had she accidentally woken up Watson with her little pranks, and now he would be angry with her? A few seconds later, the young man opened his green eyes with some difficulty and looked at the Duchess. But fortunately, he did not look angry and even quietly called his friend by name. Very gently and carefully, the future knight took Arinda's fragile hand in his palms, pressed it to his heart, and in such a touching position he fell asleep again, as if nothing had happened. Perhaps he hoped to please Maleficent in this way, but if so, the young man miscalculated. In fact, the girl felt monstrously awkward and wanted to remove her hand. Here, Serena and Luke noticed the protagonist frozen over Watson in a strange pose, and the brunette, almost dying of shame and fear, instantly pulled her hand away and pretended that nothing strange had happened. Luckily for her, Eleanor decided to ignore what she saw. Instead, she bragged that she had already finished her homework because Oscar was surprisingly good at explaining the material. As for the wizard himself, he, on the contrary, clearly suspected something because he snorted irritably, took the main character by the hand, and said that he sent her to rest and not to do all sorts of nonsense. When the Duchess snorted in response and asked what he would do when the long-awaited hour of rest finally arrived, the young sorcerer agreed, snapped his fingers, and the room instantly plunged into darkness. After that, he created a fireball in his hand, giving off a weak light like from a fire, and in a conspiratorial tone asked, "Do the girls know about the terrible history of their beloved academy?" Lowering his voice even further to a hoarse, eerie whisper, the magician explained that the fountain in the park which they see every day is actually unusual. If you approach it as soon as the sun rises above the horizon, there will be blood in its water. But that's not all. If someone is brave enough to approach this terrible place and look into the blood, he will get a chance to see something. A huge, bloody, disembodied hand that would grab the curious victim in a vice and drag him into a bloody abyss would be the last thing the unfortunate student would see, and on that note, Oscar ended the tale. True, at the same time, he also grabbed Orinda to scare her and very quickly regretted it, because Maleficent, out of fear and anger, hit him in the stomach with all her might with her fist. The teenager doubled over and croaked that in the future the protagonist would be better off using magic rather than physical blows. They were a bit too much, and the brunette even felt remorse for hitting her friend too hard. Forcing a smile through his tears, the young wizard noted that his partner was a very scary person, much worse than any bedtime horror story, and the girl, angry again, threatened to hit him again, this time in the face. Instead of being scared, Luke mockingly said, "How scary!" and patted the girl on the head so that she actually thought about whether she should give him another slap. In any case, she would not have had time to carry out her threat because the gray-haired young man was about to leave. Having returned the illumination to the room, he warned that roll call would soon begin. Serena thanked him with a sweet smile for everything he had done, assuring him that she would always be in his debt. But Maleficent looked as if she didn't know whether she was happy about his departure or not. Oscar hoisted the unconscious Reynold onto his shoulder as if he were a sack of potatoes and warned the girls that they would see each other again tomorrow. But first, one more thing. Smiling so hard that his lips almost cracked, the gray-haired teenager said that wandering around the girls' dorm alone could be dangerous. What if you run into a ghost? After bidding Orinda goodnight, Luke teleported away in a blue glow, while Eleanor looked at her astonished friend with surprise and interest. Serena probably interpreted all this as a sign that the main character was afraid of scary stories, because later the friends slept in the same bed, and while the empath tenderly hugged the Duchess like a mother, Maleficent did not tire of cursing the guy for this nastiness. The next day, while the girl was walking down the hallway, 2 other students shared a creepy rumor. It turns out that their mutual friend had met 2 completely unfamiliar girls in the hallway the day before, and subsequently was unable to even find any records about them in the documents. While they were discussing what it could be, the former dugout stopped, became wary thought, and came to the conclusion that she knew perfectly well what kind of women they were talking about. Meanwhile, the gossips described to each other in detail the appearance of the mysterious strangers, and yes, they exactly matched the female alter egos of Oscar and Reynold. When the friends were reunited on the arm, Maleficent turned to the young wizard and asked him, not without irritation, what was it like to become famous overnight, huh? At first, the sorcerer didn't understand what he was talking about, and the brunette, looking at him with disgust rephrased it. What's it like to become a celebrity ghost overnight? Now Luke understood what it was about, and Eleanor understood too. She experienced an incredible surge of Spanish shame, remembering how the guys came to their room in female form, and the protagonist ordered the magician to erase her memories for her own good. Hearing the question, "What memories?" Orinda screamed furiously at the entire audience, and when she realized this, she shyly switched to a whisper, but Oscar only offendedly stated that he had been preparing for this trick for a long time in order to appear a real beauty. In any case, he refused to fulfill this particular wish of Maleficent, citing that he simply was not able to cleanse Serena's mind. As it turned out, there was a very serious reason for this. Mind magic was a very complex task, requiring a delicate approach from the sorcerer, and one awkward action could lead to the loss of valuable and useful information. The former Earthling was genuinely confused by this. After all, she remembered very well how easily and confidently Oscar had recently suggested erasing the memories of teachers, or Noah. The young mage explained that using such spells on his girlfriends and on everyone else were completely different things for him, and now the protagonist clearly realized that all other people were just extras for him who could be joked about with fun and impunity. He thought exactly the same way as Orinda herself in her previous lives, not perceiving other people as something worthy of attention, and the girl felt so ashamed that she simply quietly asked her friend not to joke like that anymore. Meanwhile, Eleanor, with even greater excitement, told her friends that a combined fencing exam was coming up soon, and the main character realized, that time had already come. In the original book, this episode involved a sword duel between Oscar and Hensley, but the brunette decided to pretend she didn't know anything so that those around her wouldn't suspect anything. Talentedly feigning shock, the newcomer noted that it was unfair. The boys from Class B specialize in hand-to-hand combat and would easily win, and the blonde clarified that therefore the fights would only be held between young magicians and politicians. Realizing that final exams would begin during these classes, the protagonist hugged Eleanor, not because she was as terrified of the upcoming tests as one might have thought, but because the Earthling desperately did not want summer vacation to begin. The reason is simple. Then the main character will have no choice but to return to Maleficent's native estate, the very one that in her eyes has long since turned into an abode of evil. And then the hellish years will begin. Orinda will again have to endure William's hateful, smug face, listen to her father's hypocritical instructions, and pretend to be an exemplary daughter. She will again need to read mountains of letters with various invitations and proposals, and what is most terrible, she will again need to contact Noah so that the old emperor can boast of his son and his passionate balls. For the former Earthling, this was a fate worse than death, and she was determined to escape, taking with her only a couple of the most necessary things. Fortunately, Serena was kind enough to agree to shelter her friend for the summer. Meanwhile, the forgotten Luke reasonably wondered if Maleficent was planning to beat up Noah herself during the upcoming lesson. Otherwise, why would she take regular lessons from Reynold? For added drama, Oscar even repeated word for word Orinda's old promise that Hensley, if he is crushed, it will be by me personally, to the brunette's great displeasure. But when it came to execution, the Duchess immediately started to fidget, reminding that she didn't even fully remember which side of the blade to hold, and in response to the magician's good-natured words that the force of a blow to the solar plexus would guarantee victory, the brunette threatened to hit him again. Even the argument about photographic memory didn't work, because as the time traveler rightly noted, there was a difference between ordinary information and movements that had to be honed by the body to perfection. But Eleanor simply advised that he study with Watson more often and more diligently. She had suffered a lot because of this cold, cruel prince, and Serena, no matter how good-natured she was, wanted Maleficent to take revenge on him once and for all by beating him up in front of all the other students. After thinking it over carefully, the protagonist admitted that it made sense. She herself really wanted to break the nose of this arrogant, cruel idiot, and she couldn't think of a better way to release the stress from the murders in past lives. Just one thought about this was enough for the main character to finally cast aside her doubts and become inflamed with a thirst for victory, so that searching for Reynold for additional lessons became only a matter of time. With Watson, as expected, there were no particular problems. He easily agreed so that the girl could realize her dream and take revenge on her hated fiancé. During the training, the former Earthling realized that she had inadvertently made the red-haired swordsman hate the prince even more than he did in the original source, which meant that it was very doubtful that he would agree to become a member of the Imperial Knightly Guard in the future. Of course, it wasn't like the protagonist was the most important thing in his life, but she still worried about how her actions would affect the fate of others. And because of this, she couldn't really concentrate until the mentor directly ordered her to stop thinking too much. As would be the case in real life, the novice swordswoman was no match for the experienced and trained swordsman. She had already received an injection in a vital point for the 15th time and felt an inexpressible despondency. Understanding perfectly well what she was thinking, Reynold carefully wiped the sweat from Orinda's forehead and quietly advised her not to worry. It wasn't that she was untalented, but simply that new skills weren't mastered with half a kick. When Watson openly admitted that he did not know whether Maleficent would be able to acquire sufficient skill in a week, she grimaced sarcastically, like, "You can't even console me with some empty formality," and then the red-haired knight sternly reminded that you should not carelessly throw around words that you yourself are not sure of. The main character took this as a hint that she had no chance and became completely despondent, so the worried mentor quickly assured his protégé that at least she was learning quickly. The brunette only pouted capriciously in response, as if Reynold had first frozen her out with his merciless cold words, and now look how he was trying to calm and comfort her. Luckily, he didn't have Serena's gift for reading the emotions of others, so he warmly assured his friend that she already had impressive stamina, which was very useful for a fighter. For a moment, Arinda remembered how this same warrior lay on the bed and looked at her touchingly, and this embarrassed Maleficent so much that she quickly turned away. Only Watson clearly took this gesture as a symbol of something wrong, because on the contrary, he tried to catch the protagonist's eye again with a worried look and ask her something. The atmosphere around changed very abruptly and noticeably. One might have thought that some invisible, mischievous Cupid had flown nearby and decided to shower mortals with a whole hail of his fatal arrows. Some part of the main character's mind, the one responsible for logic and balanced decisions, was now screaming, "Don't give hope, don't close the distance, don't try to play with your own and other people's feelings." To ease her conscience, the girl reminded him that nothing terrible was going to happen now anyway. Her friend couldn't think about anything except classes and revenge, so she calmly turned away, pretending that everything was fine. To turn it into a joke, she suggested that Reynolds should later duel Luke, and the wizard who was watching the class with Serena shouted from afar, "Was he allowed to use magic?" Watson was genuinely surprised not even by this, but by the fact that Oscar was in principle capable of wielding a blade, but the protagonist reassured him, adding that the sorcerer was probably a mediocre warrior. The novel mentioned that the magician and the prince were equal in strength, so Maleficent wanted to know in advance what to expect from Noah, and she was interested in remembering Reynolds' techniques, but he himself was worried because he had never fought with the wolf before. To calm her friend down and see the desired duel, the main character quietly whispered that the knight had nothing to fear. He would surely emerge victorious from this fight. The man turned pink and smiled. Someone else would have seen through such an elementary provocation with ease, but he was too straightforward and trusting for that. The young man and the girl agreed that they would fight each other one more time for the last time in order to make sure that Arinda was made of really strong stuff, and Oscar shouted in the background, like, "Dear sirs, don't you want to know my opinion about the duel?" The next shot shows Maleficent sitting side by side with Eleanor, and how they both watched the boys fight, with the blonde noting not without surprise that Luke is actually a good swordsman. It was unknown whether the gray-haired teenager used some kind of magic to give his red-haired opponent a beating, or whether he was naturally gifted with colossal talent, but so far the fight was on equal terms with no clear advantage for either side. As it turned out from the thoughts of the traveler, nothing of the sort. It was not a matter of witchcraft or some innate abilities, it was just that the trickster, despite the ridicule directed at swordsmen, had diligently studied fencing from a young age. Watching the fight, the protagonist noted that the teenage sorcerer may be inferior to such a genius of chivalry as Watson, but he is still a great fighter, even more skilled than the author described. Oscar and Reynolds continued to skirmish for a few seconds before the latter, with one powerful movement, knocked the wooden blade out of his opponent's hands and placed his own at his throat, marking a mortal wound. As it turned out, the fight did not last very long, only 1 minute and 30 seconds. And the offended Luke stated in his defense that he would have definitely won if he had cast a spell, and that he was not weak, but that his opponent was abnormal. The newcomer patted him mockingly and with feigned concern assured him that yes, he was a good boy and didn't have to jump up, and in general it would be better to go get a bite to eat now. The guy warned that he would go out for a drink, teleported away, but returned just a few seconds later with a wet head and clothes, since he also splashed himself with water from the fountain. Saying that he was painfully hot, the gray-haired teenager shook his head with terrible force, spraying drops in all directions, and the dugout realized that this was petty revenge for her teasing, and she put up a barrier around herself. After this, there is another time skip taking the audience straight to the coveted day of the competition. 10, if not hundreds of students sat in the stands and shouted, demanding the duelists to come out like Romans waiting for the gladiators. Oscar, fiddling with his sports equipment, quietly grumbled that because of this, with the tournament about to begin, his favorite activities of sorcery had completely faded into the background. Arinda, choosing a wooden blade nearby, explained that the teachers had scheduled the exam in magic for the last day of school, and besides, she had no doubts about her witchcraft abilities, unlike her physical ones. The silver-haired wizard asked who she was thinking of fluffing up her ponytail in front of, and arrogantly added that both skills needed constant honing, but the aristocrat had no time for that. She was looking for the model she had worked with last time. But then Serena came up to them. She marked Maleficent's sword with red ink so that her friend would not confuse the right thing with anything else, but the protagonist quickly became completely uninterested in it because Eleanor tied her hair in a ponytail, becoming even sexier and more irresistible. What happened next had already been repeated many times. The brunette, like the last simp, threw herself on the empath's neck again, and even the blonde herself was worried that she would be overwhelmed with unnecessary gifts again. Luke would probably have made a disparaging comment about how disgusting he found it, but before he could, the ceremonial gong sounded, and Noah Hensley walked into the room like a celestial being, gracing the wretched mortal world with his presence. One look at his smug, well-groomed face was enough to make the former Earthling angry and mentally wonder why she even turned her head, knowing exactly what she would see. But it was also a signal that the childish games were over and it was time to act. Serena began to braid Arienda's hair into a similar ponytail, reminding her that the duel with Edmund had been officially approved by the organizers. Now it would be impossible to take back her words and ask to cancel the duel, but Eleanor was not going to intimidate the young aristocrat. On the contrary, she convinced the protagonist that she would definitely cope. The blonde looking the Duchess straight in the eyes with her eyes that sparkled like sapphires reminded her that she had been preparing, not twiddling her thumbs, so there was no need to worry. Maleficent agreed, but then Oscar intervened in their conversation. The wizard arrogantly declared that the girl was acting too confidently, and she asked in response, "Wasn't it because she beat him with swords yesterday?" Luke clearly hated losing, so he immediately came up with an excuse that victory was only achieved because he twisted his ankle, but Eleanor added with a grin that she did not notice any injuries. Then she warned the main character that she would have to fight first. Perhaps because Arienda, contrary to centuries-old traditions herself, announced who exactly she wanted to beat up in the arena. In another situation, she might even have been scared, but not now. The feeling that the most important moment was very close only increased her concentration, and it would have been in any case because of Noah's status. The main characters, having completed all the preparations, moved to the stands where the students continued to howl and shout, demanding bread and circuses, and the herald asked the participants if they were ready. As the empath had warned, the first duel was to take place between Arienda Maleficent and Noah Hensley von Edmund, and contemptuous whispers began to creep across the stands. "They say it's not interesting, the girl has no chance against the guy, especially one who has been learning to wield a blade since birth." According to the rules of the ceremony before the start of the duel, both participants had to demonstrate mutual respect to each other through bows, which the characters did temporarily, hiding their true feelings. Taking advantage of that rare moment when their faces were relatively close to each other and the protagonist did not try to scold him, the young man whispered whether the brunette had asked for a duel personally. But the former dugout was not going to give in to the enemy even in such an insignificant detail as a simple answer to an elementary question, so she simply sent him on an erotic walk, looking him straight in the eye with anger. As had happened many times before, the red-eyed teenager showed no sign that the harsh words had affected him. When the time for bows ended and the herald announced that the fight was about to begin, Hensley calmly stepped back and drew his blade. At that moment, the traveler recalled all the instructions that she had received from Reynold during that week. For example, that it was more important to watch not your weapon, but the direction of the enemy blade's tip. You need to concentrate on it, so that the rest of the world simply disappeared from your perception. Inspired by this advice, the girl took another short breath and then dealt Edmund a crushing oblique blow with both hands, but the prince, to his credit, not only foresaw such a move, but also easily parried it. But the protagonist, not embarrassed for a second, continued to attack again and again, weapons with a blade like a machine, and even the cold-blooded Noah at this moment fell into a stupor, not expecting such pressure and skill from someone who had never touched a weapon before. His surprise was so strong that the prince at one point directly asked his would-be bride if she had studied the art of combat, even though he was wasting valuable seconds' effort and oxygen in doing so. To be fair, Hensley himself was a very experienced and strong opponent. Even the brunette, with her photographic memory and knowledge of subsequent events, had great difficulty blocking and parrying the enemy's blows. Knowing the book this time helped her no less, if not more than diligent studies with Watson. Thanks to this, Maleficent was able to put the sword on the right side at the right moment, thereby repelling a very strong and dangerous attack. The protagonist had time to think that in a different situation, she would not have been able to win anyway, no matter how many moves she remembered. After all, what is more important is how quickly and skillfully the body acts. But if the opponent exactly repeats his actions from the book, then the situation is completely different. Arinda even allowed herself to mock the prince, noting that he had time to wag his tongue, and then raised her leg back, exactly as Oscar did during a similar duel in the original source. The heir to the throne did exactly what the main character had hoped for. He rushed at her like an enraged bull and raised both hands in such a way as to defeat his rival with one swift and crushing attack. It was not a furious swing of the stick, but on the contrary, a carefully thought-out and memorized move. In another case, it could even have given the prince victory, but unfortunately for Noah, the former Earthling knew what to expect and easily dodged. What happened next took a matter of seconds, but a lot happened in those moments. The girl used a classic feint, pretending to want to hit from the left, and then attacked from the other side, and the audience watched it all with bated breath. When the fight came to an end, everyone froze. The guys and girls who had previously ridiculed Maleficent now sat like motionless statues with their mouths wide open, and even Oscar and Eleanor could not take their eyes off the arena. As expected, the protagonist achieved a brilliant victory over the hated groom. Her trick worked completely, and now Hensley looked in disbelief at the tip of the wooden sword touching his neck. The herald, having regained his breath and recovered from the shock, loudly announced that Arinda had won the duel, and this seemed to be a signal that called on the audience to explode with applause and enthusiastic cries. In another situation, the young Duchess would probably have beamed with pride and self-satisfaction, but for now she completely ignored the people in the area. She and Hensley continued to glare at each other. What happened immediately after that was not shown to the readers. Instead, there was another short time skip showing how the students crowded around the classroom where Maleficent was studying, and Oscar annoyedly told her, "If I had known that this would happen, I would not have supported it." He was simply annoyed by the crowds of fans following their group after the protagonist's victory, and she quietly muttered that the fans would be more useful if they teased "that idiot." But Eleanor gently chided her for being unethical. This could not spoil the malicious joy of the former Earthling, and she, with a smile literally savoring it, repeated the fact that Hensley, the prince she hated, was now disgraced before the entire academy. Then Watson approached his friends, and the main character happily greeted him, and the young man himself also looked much happier, not embarrassed to show those around him, albeit a very slight smile. As detached as he was, Reynolds had heard about what had happened on the dueling ground, but the swordsman simply wanted to hear the news from the young Duchess herself. Naturally, Maleficent confirmed everything and hastened to thank her mentor, but the red-haired boy calmly replied that it was not worth it. The newcomer earned her victory completely on her own. And when Watson asked with some awkwardness whether Arinda felt better, she happily confirmed that yes, she had. She had unleashed all her negativity on Edmund, like an ocean terrorizing the coast with huge waves. The teenager replied with a smile that he was very glad to hear this, and at that moment some kind of supernatural warmth mixed with pleasure seemed to emanate from him. But the brunette was not so much pleased as worried by this. She still did not want to make guys fall in love with her, and besides, she was panicky afraid of a negative reaction from her beloved Serena. On the other hand, if she just starts avoiding Reynolds without explanation, it will be even more awkward and suspicious, so you need to find a middle ground, behave as naturally as possible, but that's all. Then the bell rang, warning of the start of classes, and Watson hurried to say goodbye. As he walked through the crowd of newly formed fans, the former dugout awkwardly waved after him, thinking that the relationship was simply not for her. The next day, when the main characters were walking down the hallway and Arinda asked what they were having for lunch, the empath answered that it would be pasta with shrimp, lemon, and baguette. The fencer added turkey with vegetables, and the wizard, his incomparable love. The protagonist replied with a tired face that she didn't really want to eat it and would prefer to refuse to, which Oscar, with theatrical dramatics, replied that the brunette had wounded him to the very heart. As it turned out, Luke fell asleep in class and the time traveler mentioned this, ridiculing the guy's statement that he always makes every effort. But the sorcerer not only did not take offense, but also said that Maleficent should have understood why he suddenly started snoring. While these two were talking, the other students continued to go about their business. Some were diligently cramming the upcoming material, some were talking to others, the standard routine of any educational institution. Looking at all this, Arinda suddenly realized what exactly had happened, and the gray-haired boy didn't even try to deny that he had rewritten other people's memories. He portrayed it as his typical joke. Now all the students, young and old, will think that the protagonist has always been a great warrior, thanks to which she defeated Prince Noah on the final exam. And as a result, no more annoying admirers and hangers-on. It later turned out that Oscar had gone even further, even encroaching on the teacher's memories. Only his own mind, as well as the brains of Maleficent and Hensley, remained in its original form, but then the young man planned to dispel the spell. After all, he could not correct the minds of the rest of the world. But even so, the main character was incredibly impressed. Her friend, who almost always behaved like some kind of harmless prankster and joker, changed the memory of hundreds, if not thousands of people, and spoke about it with offensive casualness. But Luke continued to pretend that he hadn't done anything significant. It was natural that they were all annoyed by a crowd of strangers, and Arinda felt real fear even calling the guy crazy in her thoughts. Of course, the protagonist couldn't help but admit that the lack of annoying attention was cool, but she couldn't resist asking directly if the young archmage could use his abilities like this. After all, it was on the very edge of the law. But then, clearly realizing that this approach wouldn't work with the trickster, she rolled her eyes wearily and rephrased it. Why would the future head of the tower do something like this for her? Here Serena intervened in the conversation. Grabbing the young Duchess by the hand, she almost desperately recalled her words about, "We love you more than you can imagine," and assured that if she or Watson had such powers, they would have cleared the minds of all the people of the Academy in the same way. Eleanor then thought that perhaps she was putting too much importance on their ordinary teenage friendship, and asked Maleficent directly if this was true from her own point of view. The protagonist once again thought what a stupid idiot she was. After all, she had long since screwed up the original storyline, but she constantly continued to perceive it as the ultimate truth, not paying attention to the surrounding environment and inadvertently hurting her friends. So before it was too late, the black-haired aristocrat shouted to the fair-haired girl that no, the latter was not mistaken, and Arinda herself had brainwashed even God himself if someone else had been in her place. Eleanor said nothing, apparently considering any words unnecessary in this situation. She simply smiled with the corners of her lips turned pink, and her eyes sparkled as if before crying. Having started to eat, the traveler noted what a joy it was to have the simple opportunity to eat without being distracted by the annoying presence of strangers. And she even wondered why Luke hadn't done this the first time when rumors began to spread about the brunette's great magical gift. Oscar either jokingly or seriously reproached the heroine for hypocrisy, reminding her how she herself had asked him 5 minutes ago whether he had gone too far, and the Duchess, having changed her shoes, declared that she humbly accepted the favor given in part. While the rest of the people were choosing their lunch, ignoring the presence of the one they had recently been ready to pray, to Luke asked sarcastically if the fact of accepting the service meant resignation to all its features and consequences, and the aristocrat, embarrassed, said no, that was different. Rolling spaghetti on her fork, Maleficent thought that now she was accepting the kindness and benefit of the friendship of those around her, but in the future, everything could change. She had already greatly altered and confused the original story, and now she would not die in 5 years from the executioner's axe. But in the end, she came to the conclusion that the most important thing was Serena's choice. No matter how all the other circumstances turned out, the protagonist would do everything possible to ensure that her beloved heroine got her happy ending. They started flirting and chirping again like two nightingales in love, touching each other's rosy cheeks, smiling, complimenting each other, and saying funny nonsense. Oscar had seen this kind of cooing many times, and he was terribly tired of it. Not wanting to endure it again, he sighed deeply and tiredly, and then loudly asked how much longer he had to endure such obscenities. Realizing that at that moment Luke had dropped his usual shell of sarcasm and was vulnerable, the former Earthling couldn't resist making a joke. She grinned sarcastically and asked why he had started complimenting him on his appearance too. But this jab was easily broken by the young sorcerer's counterattack. He relaxed, smiled slightly, and replied that he did not need such reminders because he always remembered his beauty, and then Reynold demanded that the sorcerer shut up. The gray-haired teenager indignantly screamed that Watson had previously been as mute as a fish, and now look, he decided to express his displeasure, but the swordsman coldly retorted that it was better to keep his mouth shut if he was going to talk nonsense. It was more beneficial for everyone. After this, the swordsman began to completely ignore Oscar, much to his disappointment, and focused on Maleficent. The redhead was wondering if that man would hurt her anymore. Of course they were talking about His Highness Crown Prince Noah Hensley von Edmund. Reynold was worried that the brunette would want to take revenge for the defeat, and Luke immediately declared that he would then simply teleport him away somewhere in the mountains. The time traveler admitted that the idea was very interesting, but the prince was not worth it. If it became known that he had left the academy without permission, it would immediately reach the ruling family, and investigation would begin, and in the end, the young archmage would get into deep trouble. Watson, still worried, asked if the girl was angry, and Maleficent honestly admitted that she would most likely feel hostility towards the red-eyed guy for the rest of her life. Looking at her interlocutor very seriously and intently, the protagonist explained that it was not even a matter of ordinary anger. She sincerely, truly hated the Emperor's eldest offspring. The look made the usually imperturbable guy break out in a cold sweat. He asked what Hensley had done to deserve such poisonous hostility from Orinda, and the woman, as in the past, hesitated, unable to reveal the truth. Then the main character decided to try a completely different approach. Looking at the young swordsman with some slyness, she asked if Reynold thought all this was going too far. Unable to bear her gaze, the swordsman lowered his face and admitted that if Maleficent couldn't stand someone, then she really had good reasons for such an attitude. In any case, Watson was ready to believe his best friend just like that without any evidence or explanations, and such a trusting attitude even amazed the brunette herself, judging by her face. And then she turned pink and started smiling almost from ear to ear. That's how happy the former Earthling was to know that someone was ready to completely trust her without any material evidence, especially since we were talking about her favorite character. Meanwhile, Oscar stroked the protagonist's head and grumbled that Noah was just one of those disgusting people who were incredibly difficult to love, and the girl, laughing, asked if her friends knew what Edmund had told her before the duel. Making an absurdly pathetic face, she repeated his words, "You personally asked for a duel, didn't you?" as if it were the most absurd and funny thing that could possibly be imagined. When Maleficent admitted that she had simply sent Hensley away in the most vulgar manner in response, a happy Luke again ruffled her black hair, claiming that yes, this was what one should expect from his chosen one. Meanwhile, Eleanor admitted that she hated to scold other people, but even she could not stand up for the imperial heir. It did not matter how high his origin was, the red-eyed one had no right to offend Orinda like that. With her eyes glowing with excitement, the heroine confirmed that everything was so, and then added that she would not be satisfied with just one victory. She wanted to continue to take revenge on Noah. She even had an idea for this topic, and with a conspiratorial air, she asked her friends if they wanted to have some fun. True, the result quickly disappointed her. No one was able to come up with a sufficiently interesting and original version of revenge. In the end, they agreed to meet again and try, and Oscar was given a special warning not to turn into a woman. They also asked him not to tell scary stories, and Luke immediately sneered. Did the first one really scare the girls that much? Oddly enough, this was what gave Maleficent an idea, and she grinned happily like a cat that had eaten too much cream.